Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping, where we explore real cases with calm narration, emotional depth, and haunting detail. If you enjoy stories told softly and slowly, we invite you to like, subscribe, and comment below. Let us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and allow your mind to drift into the shadows of one unforgettable mystery. The disappearance of Alyssa Turney. It was the last day of school in Phoenix, Arizona, in May of 2001. A dry wind blew across the suburbs, rattling palm fronds and stirring dust in the gutters. 16-year-old Alyssa Turney was supposed to be celebrating the start of summer vacation. Instead, she vanished, leaving behind a backpack, an untouched bedroom, and a sister who would spend the next 2 decades searching for answers. That morning had seemed ordinary. Alyssa, with her chestnut hair and guarded smile, was a junior at Paradise Valley High School. She wasn't the most popular girl in school, but she had friends, decent grades, and a quiet wit that endeared her to those who knew her well. Her younger sister Sarah, just 12 at the time, idolized her. They lived with their father, Michael Turney, a former sheriff's deputy and electrician. Their mother had died of cancer when Sarah was just a baby. From the outside, theirs seemed a stable, if unremarkable, home. Michael had raised the girls largely on his own, and while his parenting style was described as strict, it didn't raise many alarms at the time. On that day, May 17th, Sarah remembered Alyssa being dropped off at school in the morning. Michael picked her up around lunchtime, saying they were going to have an early summer celebration, maybe lunch out, maybe some shopping. But when Sarah returned home later that afternoon, her sister was gone. Michael told Sarah that Alyssa had run away. According to him, they had gotten into an argument during their outing, and she stormed off. He claimed she left a note in her bedroom that said she was heading to California and never wanted to be found. The note was brief. Its tone was dismissive, unsigned, and uncharacteristic of Alyssa. It read almost like a script, something written not from the heart, but to fulfill a narrative. Still, Michael reported her missing as a runaway, and the police initially treated the case as such. After all, teenagers ran away. Sometimes they came back, sometimes they didn't. But this case was different. It would take years, painful, confusing years, before anyone in authority began to question whether Alyssa had left willingly at all. Sarah remembered the days immediately following her sister's disappearance with eerie clarity. Her father didn't seem particularly worried. There were no frantic phone calls to friends, no search parties. Instead, Michael told everyone that Alyssa was rebellious, that she'd always wanted more freedom, and that she'd finally taken it. But the reality didn't quite fit the story. Alyssa had left behind all of her belongings, her wallet, cell phone, and clothing. She hadn't packed a bag, she hadn't reached out to anyone, not even her close friends, and perhaps most chillingly, she never accessed her bank account again. No one saw or heard from her, not once. Life in the Turney house shifted quickly. Within days, Michael shut down Alyssa's phone. He changed the locks. He didn't seem interested in searching for her, and when others offered help, he discouraged them. Sarah, young and confused, accepted her father's explanation at first. But somewhere deep inside, doubt began to form. Years went by. The case went cold. Police never found any trace of Alyssa in California or anywhere else. She didn't appear in databases, wasn't arrested, didn't enroll in school or apply for jobs. Her name sat in the missing persons registry, quietly collecting dust, and then, slowly, Sarah began to remember things. Small, strange things. She remembered how her father had once installed video cameras throughout the house, claiming it was for security. But only certain rooms were recorded, and he always seemed to be watching. She remembered how he kept boxes and boxes of files, binders full of paperwork and cassette tapes, documenting his daily life, interviews, even phone calls. He recorded everything, obsessively. And she remembered how he spoke about Alyssa in the past tense, even just months after she vanished. By the time Sarah was a teenager, the seeds of doubt had bloomed into quiet conviction. Something was wrong. Something had always been wrong. When she was 17, she began digging. Quietly at first, reading old newspaper clippings, piecing together timelines. As she grew older, her search became louder, more focused, and more public. She used the tools available to her: online forums, social media, and eventually podcasts and national interviews. Sarah refused to let her sister be forgotten. Her advocacy didn't go unnoticed. In 2008, 7 years after Alyssa vanished, the case was reopened, this time, not as a runaway, but as a possible homicide. When police served a search warrant at Michael Turney's home, what they found was disturbing. He wasn't just an eccentric father with a penchant for record keeping. He had over 24 improvised explosive devices, homemade pipe bombs, stored throughout the house. Along with the explosives, authorities discovered a manifesto. In it, Michael ranted about a labor union conspiracy, claiming they had kidnapped and killed Alyssa. He described plans for retaliation, plans that included mass violence. Police arrested him immediately, not for Alyssa's disappearance, but for weapons charges. He served several years in federal prison, but through it all, he maintained the same story. Alyssa had run away, and the note proved it. Sarah, now an adult, remained relentless. She continued her advocacy from outside the prison walls, writing, speaking, asking questions. In interviews, she was calm and composed, her voice steady even as she described the nightmare that had shadowed her life. She didn't claim to know exactly what had happened to her sister, but she believed her father was responsible, and she wanted justice. The case attracted renewed attention in the true crime community. Podcasts like Missing Alyssa and national media coverage brought the story to a wider audience. Sarah used her platform not to sensationalize, but to humanize, to keep her sister's memory alive, and to remind the world that Alyssa was not just a mystery, but a girl who loved alternative music, made sarcastic jokes, and once dreamed of becoming a hairstylist. In 2020, nearly 20 years after Alyssa's disappearance, there was a breakthrough. Authorities arrested Michael Turney and charged him with second-degree murder. The arrest brought hope, but also fear. Without a body, without a known crime scene, and with much of the evidence circumstantial, conviction would be difficult. The justice system moves slowly, and not all stories end with answers. Sarah braced herself for another fight. She was no longer the 12-year-old girl who had watched her sister vanish into thin air. She had grown into a woman determined to make sure no one looked away again. In many ways, Alyssa's story is not just about one girl's disappearance. It's about control, secrecy, and the ways in which trauma can echo across decades. It's about the cracks that form in the surface of a family, and the truths that hide in the silence between words. And it's about a sister who refused to stop asking questions, even when no one else seemed to want the answers. Sarah Turney stood in the courtroom hallway, years of pressure condensed into the tight clench of her hands. Her father had just been charged with second-degree murder in the disappearance of her sister Alyssa, a crime that had haunted their family and community for nearly 2 decades. The charge came not from a confession, nor from newly discovered physical evidence, but from a relentless accumulation of suspicions, contradictions, and advocacy. This wasn't the kind of case that had fingerprints or video footage. It was built instead on absence, on a note that felt rehearsed, on behavior that grew more troubling with every layer peeled back. Michael Turney had maintained for years that Alyssa had run away to California. He pointed to the brief letter left behind in her bedroom, and his initial call to the police, made within hours of her supposed disappearance. But the deeper investigators dug, the more that narrative began to erode. After reopening the case in 2008, detectives spent years reviewing evidence, audio tapes, journals, Michael's detailed surveillance logs. He had recorded almost every conversation in the house, claiming it was for security. Hundreds of hours of tapes were catalogued and reviewed. There was a pattern buried in those recordings, one of increasing control and paranoia. Michael, it became clear, was a man obsessed with monitoring and managing the lives around him. He read Alyssa's personal letters, he followed her to work. Friends reported that he sometimes showed up unexpectedly, checking who she was talking to, or if she had deviated from his instructions. Several of Alyssa's friends, when re-interviewed as adults, shared stories that had seemed strange at the time, but took on new weight in hindsight. One friend recalled that Alyssa once said, half-jokingly, "If I ever go missing, it's my dad." Another remembered Alyssa coming to school upset after an argument, saying she didn't feel safe at home. At 16, those comments had seemed like exaggerated teenage frustration. But now, in light of the investigation, They felt like warnings that hadn't been understood in time. Even more chilling was what investigators didn't find. Michael had obsessively recorded conversations with nearly everyone in his life, employers, family members, strangers, but there was a noticeable gap in the audio archives. The day Alyssa disappeared, May 17, 2001, was absent from the recordings. There were tapes from the day before and the day after, but nothing from that day. Nothing to corroborate his version of events. Police also discovered that Michael had called Alyssa's cell phone after she disappeared, not once, but multiple times. In one message, left days after she was supposedly gone, he said, "Alyssa, please call me. You have people worried. We're going to call the police." But the tone felt strangely performative. It sounded like something someone would say if they wanted to be heard saying it, not necessarily because they believed the person was on the other end. Even more confusing were Michael's own writings. He left journals, typed notes, and taped monologues, where he spoke about Alyssa's abduction by a shadowy union group. He insisted that she had been taken and murdered by men connected to the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, people he believed were following him, tapping his phone, and trying to destroy his life. To investigators, the story sounded like a conspiracy fantasy, grandiose, contradictory, and unsupported by any physical evidence. They found no record of union harassment, no connection between Alyssa and any of the names Michael claimed were involved, no motive for such a targeted abduction, and yet in his tapes, Michael spoke as if the case was already solved, and he was the only one who could see the truth. One document stood out. In a 300-page manifesto titled Diary of a Madman Martyr, Michael laid out his plan to attack a union hall with the bombs he had stored in his house. He intended to die in the process, taking with him the people he believed had murdered Alyssa. Police intervened just in time, but the manifesto revealed more than a plan for violence. It painted a portrait of a man unraveling, obsessed with control, revenge and secrecy. Still, even with the mounting suspicions, the state struggled to prosecute. The biggest obstacle was the lack of a body. Without forensic evidence, no remains, no confirmed crime scene, every theory was circumstantial. And yet, sometimes the absence of evidence becomes its own kind of evidence. Alyssa had vanished without a trace. She had not accessed her social security number, no job history, no phone, no sightings, and she had left behind every piece of her identity, items no teenager would leave behind voluntarily if they planned to start a new life. As years turned into decades, her absence became louder than words. Sarah never stopped listening for it. She poured herself into the case, not just as a grieving sister, but as an advocate. She posted regularly on social media, gaining traction on TikTok, Instagram and Twitter. She engaged with journalists, podcast hosts, and anyone willing to elevate Alyssa's story. Her message was never cruel or vengeful. She didn't scream into microphones. Instead, she spoke softly, methodically, and with a measured grief that resonated with thousands. "I don't need people to hate him," she once said about her father. "I just want people to know who Alyssa was, and that she mattered." Her approach drew national attention. She appeared on news segments and true crime podcasts. One episode of the podcast Missing Alyssa became a flashpoint for the case, presenting the known facts with clarity and restraint. Listeners from around the world began asking the same question: why hadn't this gone to trial sooner? In 2020, Sarah's persistence finally paid off. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office announced that Michael Turney would be charged with second-degree murder. The indictment was a victory, but a fragile one. Michael pleaded not guilty. He was now an older man, his health reportedly declining. He sat silently in court as the charges were read, offering no reaction, no remorse. He still claimed that he loved Alyssa, that he had done nothing wrong. He repeated the same stories about the union, about government plots, about being the real victim. For Sarah, the courtroom was both a beginning and an ending. She knew the path ahead would be long and uncertain. There would be pre-trial hearings, legal delays, expert witnesses. The burden of proof would rest with the state. The absence of forensic evidence would be used against them. The defense would point to the note, to Alyssa's supposed rebellious streak, to the possibility, however remote, that she had chosen to disappear. But Sarah also knew that silence couldn't be the last word. She had spent 20 years collecting the echoes of her sister's life, photos, letters, stories. She had become a steward of memory, preserving not just the facts of the case, but the soul of the person behind it. Alyssa was not just a victim, she had been a bright, sarcastic teenager, who loved Marilyn Manson, told inside jokes with her friends, and dreamed about a future beyond the boundaries of their complicated home. Sarah spoke often about the weight of uncertainty, how it felt to grow up in the shadow of an unspoken truth. Her life had been shaped by questions with no answers, holidays with an empty chair, and a father whose love had always felt conditional. And yet, through it all, she found a kind of peace, not in knowing, but in refusing to stop asking. This isn't a story with a clean ending, not yet. The trial looms, and with it the chance for a verdict, a resolution, maybe even a sense of justice. But the real story lives in the spaces between, the ordinary days made strange by absence, the childhood shaped by silence, the resilience born from grief. Alyssa Turney's name is now known far beyond the desert suburb, where she disappeared. Her story has traveled through voices. Her sister's voice, amplified by compassion and courage, has carried her memory across time and distance. In the end, it may not be a courtroom that defines this story. It may be the quiet persistence of love that never surrendered to forgetting. Michael Turney's trial loomed like a storm cloud over the Arizona desert, as the summer sun baked the pavement, and cicadas droned in the trees. Sarah found herself once again suspended in a waiting game. Court hearings came and went, some delayed, others procedural. Each one was a reminder that even with an arrest, justice moves slowly, especially when time has eroded evidence and memory in equal measure. Michael's defense attorneys argued what many already expected. There was no body, no forensic proof of a crime, no eyewitness testimony placing him at a murder scene, because in their view there was no murder. They insisted that Alyssa had run away, that she was unhappy, impulsive, and seeking freedom from a home that had become stifling. But those closest to her knew that story didn't add up. Alyssa was a teenage girl, yes, sometimes rebellious, sometimes angry, but she wasn't impulsive in that way. She didn't leave behind her favorite clothes, her makeup, her money or her friends. She didn't pack a bag. She had plans for the summer. She had a job lined up. She had a boyfriend she loved. And most of all, she had Sarah. The bond between the sisters had always been quiet but deeply felt. Sarah often remembered the little things, how Alyssa would straighten her hair before school, or let her pick out a song on the car stereo, how she'd whisper jokes in the back of the room when their father wasn't looking. Alyssa had protected her in a way Sarah didn't fully understand until years later, when the weight of that silence came crashing down. Their father was a complicated figure. Michael Turney had once been a deputy sheriff, then an electrician. To some, he seemed intelligent, articulate, even charming. To others, he was volatile, controlling and secretive. After Alyssa disappeared, he became reclusive. He spent hours locked in his office, surrounded by cameras, cassette tapes and files. He monitored police scanners, and wrote long winding manifestos. When Sarah was a teenager, she believed he was eccentric, but as she grew older, she began to see the patterns of control. There were the surveillance systems installed in the home, ostensibly for protection, but which focused strangely on Alyssa's room. There were the phone calls Michael would monitor, the lectures he'd record, the interrogations he'd conduct under the guise of parenting. Sarah later discovered that Michael had even secretly recorded conversations between Alyssa and her friends. In one of the tapes, Alyssa told a schoolmate she was afraid of her father, that she wasn't allowed to date, that she felt like she was constantly being watched. The tapes were damning, but incomplete. So much of what Alyssa had lived through was never recorded, and now it was unreachable, locked in a past that could only be reconstructed through fragments and memory. The 2008 search of the Turney home had yielded over 20 pipe bombs, along with the handwritten manifesto outlining Michael's plan to attack a union hall. Investigators found that Michael had become obsessed with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, blaming them for both Alyssa's disappearance and the imagined persecution he claimed to suffer.
The FBI classified his writings as domestic terrorism in nature. Yet, despite the weapons and threats, Michael never offered new information about what had happened to Alyssa. His stories changed over the years, shifting from the runaway narrative to a bizarre conspiracy involving union kidnappers, corrupt law enforcement, and deep state cover-ups. Each story contradicted the last. To Sarah, the conspiracy theories weren't just delusions, they were distractions. They allowed her father to avoid the simpler, more horrifying truth, that he may have harmed his own daughter, and then spent decades creating elaborate lies to hide from it. The emotional toll on Sarah was immense. In private moments, she admitted that pursuing the case had consumed her. There were days when she doubted herself, when the enormity of the task felt too heavy. After all, she wasn't a detective or a lawyer. She was just a sister who refused to stop asking questions. She'd spent her early adulthood not just grieving a loss, but interrogating her own childhood. What had she missed? What had she been conditioned not to see? Was there something she could have said, or done, that would have made a difference? Therapists called it survivor's guilt, though the term didn't feel quite right. Sarah hadn't witnessed a crime, but she had lived in the house. She had trusted their father, and unraveling that trust felt like losing her family all over again. In interviews, Sarah spoke softly about her father, careful not to vilify, but also unwilling to protect. She often said, "I loved my father, I still do in a way, but love doesn't mean you ignore the truth." The media, drawn to the emotional weight of the story, followed Sarah's journey closely. National headlines covered the case. Documentaries and podcasts re-examined the evidence. But Sarah remained grounded. She didn't crave fame, she craved closure. And she wanted the world to remember Alyssa as more than a mystery. Alyssa was the oldest of 5 siblings. When their mother died of cancer, Michael adopted Sarah and raised her alongside Alyssa. Though they were half-sisters biologically, their bond was full and uncomplicated. They shared everything: rooms, secrets and dreams of a future outside the control of their father. One of Sarah's most painful memories came from the day after Alyssa disappeared. Their father had told her that Alyssa was gone, that she had run off and wouldn't be coming back. Sarah had cried, begging to call her, but Michael wouldn't allow it. Instead, he sat her down and repeated over and over that Alyssa had chosen to leave them behind, that it was her fault. Even at 12, Sarah had sensed something was off, but it took years for her to fully understand the manipulation. By the time she was in college, Sarah had begun filing Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to piece together her sister's final days. She reached out to journalists, wrote letters to detectives, and eventually started a social media campaign. Her following grew rapidly. Thousands of people resonated with her message. In 2019, she launched a podcast called Voices for Justice, using it not only to tell Alyssa's story, but to highlight other missing persons cases, especially those involving overlooked or marginalized victims. It became her way of giving meaning to the years of silence. Back in court, the pre-trial proceedings for Michael Turney continued. Prosecutors knew they had a difficult road ahead. Convicting someone of murder without a body is rare, and conviction without forensic evidence is even harder. But this wasn't a case built on science, it was built on behavior. They would point to the tapes, to the missing audio from the day of Alyssa's disappearance, to the fact that Michael admitted to being the last person to see her alive, to the way he discouraged anyone from looking for her, to the control he exerted over her life, the surveillance, the stories that unraveled with time, to the violent arsenal they found in his home, to the way he spoke of his daughter, not with grief, but as a man desperate to manage perception. For Sarah, each day in court was a test of endurance. She sat through hours of testimony, stared across the aisle at the father who had raised her, and relived every painful chapter. And yet she remained composed, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She knew this might be the only chance she would ever have to see someone held accountable for Alyssa's disappearance. Outside the courthouse, people often stopped her. Some offered condolences, others offered stories of their own missing loved ones. Sarah listened, she always listened, She had come to understand that her fight was part of something larger, a broken system, a culture that too often dismissed teenage runaways, ignored red flags, and failed to protect vulnerable children. And through it all, one truth echoed loudest: Alyssa mattered. She had mattered the day she was born, the day she disappeared, and every day since. And even if the jury never returned a guilty verdict, Sarah had already won a kind of justice, one built not on punishment, but on remembrance. Alyssa Turney had not vanished without a voice. Her sister had become that voice, and through her, the world had finally begun to listen. The courtroom was quiet when the final pre-trial motions were heard. The ticking of the second hand on the clock, the soft shuffling of papers, the clearing of throats, it all seemed louder in the stillness. Sarah sat in the gallery, hands folded in her lap, watching her father as she had done so many times before, trying to decipher something behind his expressionless face. Michael Turney sat with the calm of a man who had long lived inside his own version of events. For over 2 decades, he had spun and respun the same stories, like a spider tightening a web not just around the outside world, but around himself. In his mind, Alyssa had been taken. He was the victim. The rest of the world was blind, or complicit. But in that courtroom, the narrative no longer belonged to him. The trial was scheduled to begin the following spring, though delays were likely. Witnesses had to be tracked down, expert testimony arranged. The legal machinery moved slowly, especially in a case so cold, so dependent on human memory, on impressions, on absence. Sarah knew that the odds were still against them. Prosecutors had warned her gently. A nobody case was inherently fragile. The defense would hammer the lack of physical evidence. They would point out that the police hadn't declared the case a homicide for years. They would float the possibility, however remote, that Alyssa was alive somewhere, that she had chosen disappearance, that her sister's grief had made her see a crime where none had been proven. But Sarah also knew something that couldn't be reduced to legal terms. She knew her sister. She knew the truth lived not in the evidence, but in its silence, in all the things that had been left unsaid, undone, unacknowledged, the missed birthdays, the unanswered questions, the empty seat at every milestone in her life. In her podcast, Sarah once read aloud a letter she had written to Alyssa. It was a simple thing, no theatrics, just a few paragraphs. She told her sister about her wedding day, about the way she had chosen a small quiet ceremony, about the moments she had looked into the crowd, wishing Alyssa were there, about how she'd saved a seat anyway. Grief doesn't always rule, sometimes it whispers. As the legal process dragged forward, Sarah kept moving. She continued to speak publicly, continued to highlight other cases, girls who had gone missing in the shadows, whose families had been told they were simply runaways, that they'd come back eventually. She saw those patterns now, how society often turned away when young women disappeared, especially if they were troubled, or poor, or lived in homes that didn't fit the picture of safety. And she understood something deeper. Alyssa's story was not just about her, it was about a culture of dismissal, a system that had for too long accepted disappearance as explanation. More and more, Sarah heard from people who had grown up in homes like hers, survivors of emotional manipulation, of coercive control, people who hadn't been physically hurt in the ways that left bruises, but who had been shaped by the slow erosion of agency. And for many of them, Sarah's story became a kind of mirror, a way to understand their own wounds. She never claimed to be perfect. She never pretended to have all the answers, but she showed up, day after day, telling the story, not just to find justice, but to build something with the pieces justice had left behind. In 2022, a hearing was held to review Michael Turney's health and legal competency. He was in his 70s now. He walked slowly. He looked tired. His attorneys argued that he was no longer fit to stand trial. The prosecution disagreed, but behind the legal arguments was a deeper fear that time might steal from Sarah the chance to see this case resolved in a court of law. That after all her efforts, all her advocacy, all the nights spent recording episodes, editing videos, answering emails from strangers, there might never be a verdict. It was a fear she rarely said aloud, What do you do when the person you're waiting on answers from might die before they give them? She considered visiting him in jail, just once, to ask the questions directly, but she never went. Maybe she already knew there would be no answers. Michael Turney maintained his innocence to the end. His version of events never changed, and perhaps in his own mind, he had come to believe it. Repetition has a way of making fiction feel real, even to the one who tells it. In mid-2023, the charges against Michael were quietly dismissed. The prosecutors cited the lack of physical evidence, the difficulty in meeting the burden of proof, the passage of time. It was a legal decision, not a moral one, but for Sarah, it still landed like a punch. No trial, no testimony, no chance to stand in front of a jury and say her sister's name aloud, no official reckoning, and yet the story didn't end there.
Because what Sarah had built over years of tireless work, of vulnerability, of public grief, was something the legal system couldn't take away. She had made Alyssa unforgettable. Through her podcast, her advocacy, her social media presence, Sarah had reached millions. People in countries far from Arizona now knew Alyssa's face, her smile, her voice in home videos, the details of her case, the injustice of her disappearance. In one of her last podcast episodes of that year, Sarah said, "There's no closure in this story. That's not what justice looks like. Justice is a living thing. It's me, still saying her name. It's you, listening to it." She didn't weep. She didn't rage. Her voice was steady, measured, quiet, but behind it was a strength most would never see unless they'd lived through something like it. Sarah continues to advocate. She still posts photos of Alyssa. She still answers messages from strangers. She still listens to stories. She still shows up. In many ways, this story is not about a murder. It's not even about the mystery. It's about the long aching aftermath. The years that stretch out after the headlines fade. The birthdays missed. The questions asked at 2 a.m. The weight of memory. The courage it takes to keep telling the truth, even when no one seems to be listening. Sarah's story reminds us that justice is rarely a moment. It's a movement, one made of thousands of small acts showing up to court, requesting case files, editing a podcast episode late at night, standing in front of cameras to talk about the sister who never got to grow old. Alyssa Turney was 16 when she vanished. She would be in her 40s now. Her life didn't stop because of a decision she made. It stopped because someone else made a decision for her. And even if the courts couldn't say it aloud, Sarah would never stop saying it for them. This case remains technically unsolved. Her body has never been found. Michael Turney, as of this writing, is alive and a free man. And yet Alyssa's story has been seen by more people than most missing persons cases ever will, because her sister refused to let the silence be the last word. In the end, maybe that's what justice sometimes looks like, not in verdicts or prison time, but in truth being louder than denial. Sarah still sets a place for Alyssa on her birthday. Sometimes, she says, she dreams of her, not as a teenager, but as the woman she should have become, laughing, sarcastic, protective, free. She never sees what happened, never gets the answers, but in those dreams, Alyssa is smiling, whole, untouched by the weight of what might have been. And in those dreams, Sarah finds a kind of peace, not the kind that comes from certainty, but the kind that comes from loving someone so deeply, you carry their story forward even when the world refuses to. Alyssa Turney was never just a missing person. She was a sister, a daughter, a girl who wanted more. And now, even in her absence, she has become something enduring. A voice, a name, a truth that refuses to vanish. In the early summer of 1989, the town of Springfield, Missouri, breathed a sigh of relief. The school year had ended, the days stretched long and golden, and the local chatter turned toward graduation parties and lake trips. Among the graduating seniors at Kickapoo High School that year was a soft-spoken, artistic teenager named Stacy McCall. She had light blonde hair, a thoughtful smile, and a quiet kind of warmth that made her easy to love. Her friends said she had a way of making even silence feel comfortable. That June, she and her best friend Suzanne Streeter, known to everyone as Susie, had plans like any other pair of 18-year-olds. After the graduation ceremony, they would hop between a few parties, maybe spend the night with friends, maybe go to a water park the next day. There was nothing unusual in their plans, nothing risky or wild, just two girls savoring the moment between childhood and adulthood. Susie lived with her mother, Cheryl Levitt, in a tidy single-story home on Delmar Street. Cheryl, 47, was a hairdresser by day, meticulous by nature, and fiercely protective of her only daughter. Friends described her as elegant and practical, the kind of woman who always knew where everything was and never left the house without making the bed. The day began like any other. Cheryl had spent the morning working, finishing up hair appointments in her home salon. Susie and Stacy attended their graduation, smiling for photos, hugging classmates, promising to keep in touch. There was no sense of foreboding, no signs of what was to come. That evening, the girls went to several small parties. Nothing rowdy, just teenagers in driveways and living rooms, drifting through the hours with the sweet energy of a summer night. Around 2 a.m., they decided not to drive to Branson, as they'd first planned, but to return to Susie's house to sleep instead. Stacy called her mother to let her know. "We'll be home in the morning," she said. It was the last anyone would ever hear from her. By the time morning arrived, the house on Delmar Street was still and quiet. Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, began to grow concerned when the girls didn't show up for their planned trip. At first she chalked it up to oversleeping, then to miscommunication, but after calling repeatedly with no answer, she drove to Susie's house herself. What she found was unnerving. All three women were gone, Stacy, Susie and Cheryl. Their cars were in the driveway, purses were inside. Susie's dog, a small terrier named Cinnamon, was agitated but unharmed. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing appeared broken, but something was wrong. The bed in Cheryl's room was neatly made. Makeup and toiletries were laid out on the bathroom counter, as if she'd been getting ready for bed and stopped midway. The TV was on, static humming in the living room. A broken porch light globe was found later, its glass swept neatly into a dustpan and thrown away, a strange subtle detail that stuck with investigators. Janice called police. Friends arrived, people wandered through the home, unintentionally disturbing the scene. Evidence was likely moved, erased by well-meaning concern, but even amid the confusion, the reality was clear. 3 women had vanished, leaving behind every trace of a life still in progress. Word of the disappearance spread quickly. Flyers were printed, searches began. Friends and family canvassed the area, checking alleyways, gas stations, parking lots. There was no trace. Days turned into weeks. Tips poured in, sightings, rumors, dead ends. A man called claiming he had the women and demanded ransom, but it was a hoax. A transient was seen in the area around the time of their disappearance, but no solid link was ever found. Detectives combed through the women's lives, looking for connections, motives, enemies. They interviewed ex-boyfriends, co-workers, neighbors, but the trail remained cold. There were no fingerprints, no confirmed witnesses, no credit card usage. It was as if the 3 had been plucked out of their lives by an invisible hand. The community reeled. Springfield wasn't the kind of place where people disappeared. Children began sleeping in their parents' rooms. Security systems were installed across the city. For months, local media led with daily updates. But as summer waned, so did the attention. The women's faces, once plastered across every billboard, began to fade from the front pages. Still, Janice McCall refused to give up. She transformed her grief into focus. She kept Stacy's bedroom exactly as it had been. She organized volunteer search teams, consulted psychics, spoke to journalists. Her voice never wavered, even when her eyes did. "I will find her," she said again and again. "I will bring them home." In the absence of answers, theories emerged. One suggested the women were abducted by someone they knew, someone who had knocked late at night, familiar enough to let in. Perhaps a small argument escalated. Perhaps it was an accident, covered up. Perhaps Cheryl, having walked in on something, was taken along to avoid leaving a witness. Another theory was darker, that the crime was random, a chance encounter with a stranger, a predator passing through town, a killer who saw 2 young girls,
followed them home and waited. The neatly swept glass from the broken porch light suggested someone had returned, tried to hide evidence, or perhaps even entered while the women slept, unnoticed. And then there was the theory involving an abandoned hospital nearby, a structure being torn down at the time. Some believed the women's bodies might have been hidden there, beneath tons of concrete and rubble. Cadaver dogs alerted in the area during a search, but no remains were ever found. The police followed every thread. Hundreds of leads, thousands of hours. Nothing held. Years passed. In 1997, an anonymous tip came in. A man named Robert Craig Cox, already imprisoned for kidnapping, claimed to know what happened. He said the women were dead, and that their bodies would never be found. But Cox wouldn't say more. Police couldn't verify his claims. Some saw him as a manipulator, seeking attention. Others weren't so sure. With each passing year, the trail grew colder. Susie's bedroom remained untouched. Her high school diploma still hung on the wall. Cheryl's name was never removed from her hairdressing license. Stacy's clothes hung neatly in her closet, waiting for a return that never came. The community never stopped remembering. Candlelight vigils were held, murals painted, their names whispered in the quiet hours. Susie, Stacy, Cheryl, 3 women, gone without a trace. Even in 2025, more than 3 decades later, the case remains open, technically unsolved. No arrests, no convictions, just the void where answers should be. But in the homes of those who loved them, they are not statistics, they are not cold cases, they are not forgotten, they are voices in photographs, laughter in memories, glimpses of futures never lived. And for Janice McCall, now in her 70s, the search continues, not just for her daughter, but for the truth. She still keeps a light on in the front window, just in case. The morning of June 7, 1992, began quietly in Springfield, Missouri. Birds rustled in the trees. Lawn sprinklers ticked to life. Across town, parents prepared breakfast and children complained about waking up too early. But inside the home of Janice McCall, the atmosphere had shifted. By 7:30 a.m., Janice had grown uneasy. Stacy hadn't called. She hadn't returned home. The girls were supposed to leave for a day trip to Whitewater Water Park in Branson. Stacy had been looking forward to it for weeks. She wasn't the type to flake out, not without a word. By mid-morning, Janice was dialing numbers, first Susie's house, then friends. No one had seen or heard from the girls. When her calls to the Delmar Street house went unanswered, Janice drove over herself. It was just after noon when she walked up to the small brick house shaded by a sycamore tree. Everything looked normal from the outside. The front door was closed. The cars, the girls and Cheryl's, were parked in the circular driveway. No windows broken, no alarms raised. But as Janice stepped inside, she felt it immediately. Something was wrong. There were no signs of life in the house. No television on, no sound of showers. No smells of breakfast or perfume, just silence. Susie's dog Cinnamon barked nervously, her nails clicking against the tile floor. She seemed distressed, panting and circling near the door. That alone unsettled Janice. Cinnamon was known to be protective, but not neurotic. If the girls were home, or had simply stepped out for a minute, the dog would have calmed. Janice walked through the house slowly. On the vanity in the shared bathroom, she saw all 3 women's purses sitting together, Cheryl's, Susie's and Stacy's. That made no sense. They would never have left without them. On the kitchen counter was an overturned bottle of nail polish. Nearby was Stacy's folded clothing, set down neatly before bed. Nothing was ransacked or out of place. It looked like 3 women had simply disappeared mid-routine. Later, investigators would fixate on one detail: the shattered glass globe from the front porch light, which had been swept up and thrown in the trash. No one could say when the light had been broken, or by whom, but it hinted at something small and deliberate. A subtle detail in an otherwise clean scene. Was it a sign of forced entry? Had someone broken the light to obscure the view from the street? Or had it been broken days earlier, and replaced by someone in the house? At the time, Janice didn't consider it. Her instincts were elsewhere. She called the police. The first responding officers treated it as a missing persons report, not a potential crime scene. That decision would prove costly. In the hours that followed, several friends and family members came and went from the house, trying to piece together where the women might have gone. Some picked up items, others tidied. One person even answered the phone. At 2:15 p.m., the home line rang. A strange male voice asked for someone named Susie. The caller made sexual comments, and then hung up. It wasn't until later that investigators realized this could have been a lead or a taunt. But the number wasn't traced, and the call was never repeated. By that evening, the police officially listed all three women, Stacy McCall, Suzanne Streeter and Cheryl Levitt, as missing under suspicious circumstances. The public responded with urgency. Volunteers passed out thousands of flyers across Missouri. Janice and other family members appeared on local news, pleading for information. "Please call us," she said to the camera. "If you're out there, please just let us know you're okay." The weeks that followed blurred into each other. Every phone call was a possible lead. Every shadow seemed suspicious. The McCall family, the Streeter family, and the friends of Cheryl all found themselves trapped in the same purgatory, wanting answers, dreading what they might be. The Springfield Police Department assembled a task force. They searched nearby lakes, wooded areas and abandoned buildings. They interviewed dozens of people. In one instance, cadaver dogs were brought to a recently demolished hospital site, where Susie's car had once been parked. The dogs alerted on several areas beneath the concrete, but without permission to dig, and without evidence, the leads went cold. Among the people interviewed early on were Susie's former boyfriend and a close male friend of both girls. Neither was charged. Neither had alibis that raised serious red flags. Still, some in the community remained suspicious. The families, meanwhile, tried to maintain a sense of routine. Janice continued going to work, sometimes leaving early to meet with detectives. She wore a bracelet with Stacy's name engraved on it. "I need her to know," she once told a reporter. "If she's out there and sees this, I need her to know I'm still looking." The case was featured on America's Most Wanted. The leads flooded in, but most were dead ends. Sightings from across the country, strange letters in the mail, people claiming to be psychics offering wild, often cruel, theories. In the absence of hard evidence, the community began crafting its own explanations. Some believed the women had been abducted by someone they knew, perhaps even lured by a fake emergency. Maybe a knock at the door in the early morning, a familiar face, a request for help, and then gone. Others believed it was a stranger, a drifter, a serial predator, who saw an opportunity and took it. A few whispered about drug connections, secret lives, affairs. Those rumors hurt most. There was never any credible evidence to suggest wrongdoing on the part of the women, but suspicion has a way of sticking, even in the absence of proof. Years passed. Birthdays came and went. Holidays grew quieter. The house on Delmar Street was sold. Susie's room, once bright with posters and makeup trays, was packed away in boxes. Stacy's mother never touched her room. Not for decades. It stayed just as it was on graduation night, bed made, photos on the wall, waiting. In the early 2000s, a break seemed possible. Robert Craig Cox, a former Army Ranger and convicted kidnapper, told a journalist that he knew what happened to the Springfield Three. He claimed the women had been killed and buried, and that their bodies would never be recovered. When pressed, Cox refused to give further details. "When my mother dies," he said cryptically, "I'll tell you where they are." Police investigated. Cox had been living in Springfield at the time of the disappearance and had a history of violent crime, but without physical evidence or a confession, he couldn't be charged. He remains a person of interest. As of today, no one has been arrested in connection with the case. No remains have been found. No forensic breakthroughs have cracked the silence. But the emotional toll of the disappearance lives on. For the families, the absence is not just physical, it's existential. There's no grave to visit, no facts to grieve, just endless speculation. and the haunting feeling that someone, somewhere still knows the truth. Janice McCall has become a quiet symbol of resilience. In interviews, her voice is soft but certain. She doesn't speak in dramatic tones. Her grief is not theatrical. It's enduring, measured, quietly stitched into the fabric of her life. Once a reporter asked her what she would do if Stacy were found alive. "I would hold her," she said. "And then I'd listen." As the seasons shifted in Springfield, Missouri, life moved forward in reluctant increments. School years began and ended. Roads were repaved. New families moved into quiet neighborhoods. But the small brick home on Delmar Street remained a landmark of silence. By the end of 1992, 6 months after the disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall, the investigation had turned from urgent to enduring. What had once consumed nightly headlines was now receding into back pages and whispers. But for those left behind, the mystery pressed inward, curling itself around every part of daily life. Janice McCall struggled with the quiet. In her living room, the family phone sat on its cradle like a coiled hope. For months she listened for it constantly. When it rang, when it didn't. Sometimes she swore she heard it even when it hadn't. At night she would lie awake, watching the glow of the digital clock, willing the hours to pass. She wasn't alone. Friends of Susie and Stacy, now in college, or starting jobs, found themselves stuck between mourning and hope. None had been able to attend funerals. There had been no memorials, no eulogies to mark the lives that had once been so vibrant. Instead, there was only the space the women had left behind in yearbooks, in voicemail greetings, in framed photos yellowing beneath glass. Detective Rick Bookout, one of the first officers on the scene, later admitted he believed they had missed something important in the early hours. "It's difficult," he said. "We didn't know, that day, that we were walking into a crime scene. We thought they were just late. Missing, not gone." As time passed, a pattern familiar to many long-term unsolved cases began to emerge. Leads grew more unusual. Tips came in from farther away, New Mexico, Florida, even Canada. One man claimed to have seen the women in a truck stop diner in Arkansas. Another woman said she had dreamed of their burial beneath a red barn. The Springfield police followed what they could. But tips without evidence don't hold up in court. And without bodies, even the strongest theory remained just that, a theory. There was a moment in 1997 when it seemed everything might finally break open. Investigative journalist Kathy Crane had begun digging into the background of Robert Craig Cox, the convicted kidnapper, who had hinted at knowing what happened. Cox had a troubling record, a prior conviction for kidnapping in Florida, suspected involvement in a California murder, and a history of lying to authorities. Most chillingly, he had lived in Springfield at the time the women vanished. Cox initially denied knowing anything, but in an interview several years later, his tone changed. "They're dead," he said, "and they'll never be found." Detectives were stunned. For years Cox had stayed silent. Now he was taunting them. But even then, he refused to provide specifics. When asked why he'd say such a thing, he smirked. "When my mother dies," he repeated, "I'll tell you what happened." It was both sinister and vague, enough to ignite suspicion but not enough to act upon. Police circled back. They looked into Cox's whereabouts on the night of June 6, 1992. His alibi, once provided by his girlfriend, began to fray under scrutiny. She later admitted she hadn't been with him that night. She'd lied, she said, because he asked her to. But still, without direct evidence placing Cox at the scene, without witnesses or confessions, the case couldn't move forward. The families tried not to dwell on him. There were too many what-ifs, too many half-truths. And in a case built entirely on absence, it was the uncertainty that hurt most. Cheryl Levitt's friends struggled to reconcile her disappearance with her personality. She had been cautious, detail-oriented. She paid her bills on time, kept a tidy home, called her daughter every day. The idea that she would vanish without a trace, without signs of struggle or resistance, was hard to imagine. Some speculated she had interrupted a crime in progress. Perhaps she'd come home as someone was breaking in. Others wondered if she'd been the target all along. Maybe the killer had come for her, and the girls were collateral. But police found no motive. Cheryl had no known enemies. She was well liked by clients and co-workers alike. Her financial records were clean. Her phone logs showed nothing unusual. Then there were the rumors about Susie. Some pointed to the fact that Susie had once dated a boy connected to local crime. Nothing serious, just teenage mischief. But others believed he might have owed money to the wrong people, or crossed a line. Could someone have come looking for him and found Susie instead? One of Susie's classmates recalled a strange conversation a few weeks before graduation. She said someone was following her. The classmate said, "I didn't take it seriously. None of us did." The police heard that too. But again, no names. No proof. Just the echo of a fear that had come too late to explain. For Stacy, there was even less to go on. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary teenager. No troubled past. No risky behavior. She liked roller skating, taking pictures, listening to Bon Jovi. She had planned to start college in the fall, and maybe study child development. Her disappearance was, in many ways, the most haunting of all. It had been a last-minute decision that led her to Susie's that night. Had she gone home instead, had she followed through with her plan to sleep at a friend's, she might have been spared. That randomness haunted Janice. The idea that fate, or luck, had played such a cruel part. In 2002, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children issued updated age progression images of the three women, showing what they might look like now. It was meant to revive interest. But to those who had known them, the images were painful. In each face, they saw a version of someone they'd never get to meet. Every few years, another theory would rise to the surface. In one, the women had been buried beneath a parking garage in Springfield, poured just days after the disappearance. Police received permission to scan the area with radar. Anomalies were found, but excavation was deemed too disruptive, too expensive. No digging occurred. In another theory, a transient man seen in the neighborhood days prior was implicated. He had a criminal record, had lived out of his car. But again, there was no hard evidence. He was questioned and released. Even as DNA technology improved, the case stayed stuck. There were no samples to test, no crime scene to revisit. Everything had been too clean, too early disturbed, too quietly undone. In 2020, the Springfield police released new information in hopes of reigniting public interest. They confirmed that they had re-interviewed witnesses and re-examined physical evidence, using modern forensic tools. Still, no new arrests were made, no new suspects named. What remained was a kind of quiet ritual, a town that remembered without always speaking, a silence that lived inside the spaces between what was known and what was possible. And then there was Janice. Over the years, she became a quiet advocate for other missing persons cases. She spoke to families, wrote letters, pushed for better national databases. She didn't seek the spotlight. Her voice stayed gentle, her words deliberate. I still believe she once said in an interview, "Not because I'm naive, but because that's what a mother does." She kept Stacy's bedroom intact for over 20 years. The same comforter, the same posters, the teddy bear on the shelf. Visitors said walking into the room felt like stepping back in time. But to Janice, it wasn't a museum, it was a promise. In moments of doubt, she returned to the timeline. She replayed every hour of that night, every detail of the following morning. She scoured her own memory. Had she missed something in Stacy's voice? Was there something unspoken in her words? Each time, the answer was the same. No, nothing had sounded strange. Nothing had hinted at what was to come. But that was the most frightening part. There had been no warning, no scream, just the quietest kind of vanishing. By the summer of 2022, 30 years had passed since the women disappeared. In Springfield, generations had grown up hearing their names: Stacy McCall, Suzanne Streeter, Cheryl Levitt, not as distant figures, but as part of the local landscape, like familiar street names or family stories retold around the dinner table. The house on Delmar Street had changed owners several times. Some knew its history, some didn't, but time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. New paint, new landscaping, new tenants, yet underneath it all, the ghost of that night remained. For Janice McCall, the 30-year anniversary marked a different kind of milestone, not of acceptance, but of quiet endurance. Her life had been divided in two, before June 7, 1992, and everything after. There had been no dramatic moment of closure, just a steady unfolding of days, where hope and sorrow coexisted in parallel. In public, she remained composed. In private, there were still moments she kept to herself, dreams where she saw Stacy at a distance, waving across a parking lot, glimpses that vanished as soon as she opened her eyes. Others close to the case had changed too. Friends of Susie had grown into adulthood, some became mothers, others moved far from Springfield, but all carried with them a sense of unfinished memory. "We were supposed to grow old together," one friend said during a quiet podcast interview. "We never got to see what kind of woman she would have become." Cheryl's sister, Deborah, spoke occasionally with detectives, but had come to accept the limitations of the case. "You try to move on, because that's what life demands," she once said. "But every holiday, every birthday, there's a hole in the room that nothing fills." And the investigators, some retired, others continued to revisit the file every few years. The Springfield Three had become part of department law, referenced during training, studied by new recruits. Cold case officers spoke about the investigation with a strange reverence, as if it were a riddle entrusted to each new generation of detectives. In 2021, a documentary filmmaker approached the families about producing a quiet, respectful series about the case. Janice agreed on one condition: no dramatizations, no actors, no recreations, only the facts, and the people who lived them. The project took over a year, and when it aired, the response was enormous. Viewers from across the country wrote in, some to offer condolences, others to share theories. A few even sent new tips. One letter stood out. It came from a man in his 60s, who claimed to have worked construction near a site on the outskirts of Springfield. In the early 1990s, he wrote that on the morning of June 7, 1992, he'd noticed a man parking a car off an access road that led into a wooded area. "I didn't think much of it then," he wrote, "but I remember the guy seemed out of place. No tools, no reason to be there." Police followed up. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, searched the area, turned up bones, but they were animal, not human. Another lead, like so many before it, that ended in silence. Still, the letter reminded investigators that even decades later, people were still remembering, still watching, still wondering. The enduring mystery of the Springfield Three isn't only about what happened that night. It's about the nature of unresolved grief, about the stories we tell ourselves when there is no final chapter, and about the psychological terrain of waiting for answers, for evidence, for the return of something lost. In the absence of proof, people make meaning where they can. Some believe the women are buried beneath concrete, perhaps beneath a parking garage, perhaps under a rural road. Others are convinced it was a targeted abduction by someone they knew. A few hold fast to the stranger theory, a passing predator, a chance encounter that spiraled into horror. All these versions exist at once, layered over the same timeline, the same house, the same night. No theory is provable, but none can be fully ruled out. In a more recent interview, Janice reflected on the nature of memory. "It's strange," she said. "You'd think I'd only remember the last day I saw Stacy, but I don't. I remember the ordinary ones. Her coming home from school, her brushing her hair. I remember her laugh when I'd mispronounced the names of her favorite bands." She paused then, and smiled. It's not the tragedy I think about. Not first. It's the living, who she was. That's what's real to me. As for the investigation, it remains technically open. The Springfield police still maintain a tip line. The case file is thick, over 10,000 pages, evidence logs, interview transcripts, maps, timelines. Each year, a cold case detective reviews it, looks for anything missed. In 2025, new forensic tools, once science fiction, allowed analysis of degraded DNA material. Some items collected from the house were retested. One sample produced partial male DNA, but it was inconclusive. No match in Codice. Another haunting almost lead. Still, for those involved, even a whisper of progress mattered. The case has had ripple effects far beyond Springfield. It led to changes in how missing persons reports are handled in Missouri. It prompted renewed discussions around evidence preservation, scene contamination, and early response protocol. And it reinforced what so many families of the missing already know, that in the first 24 hours, everything matters. But despite the lessons learned, the Springfield Three remain unaccounted for. No graves, no crime scene, just the sudden vacuum of 3 lives. In 2023, a candlelight vigil was held at Phelps Grove Park. Dozens gathered quietly beneath the trees. There were no speeches, just photographs placed on tables. A choir sang Amazing Grace. Some attendees hadn't been born when the women vanished, but they came anyway, because some stories live on through the collective memory of a place. And Springfield remembers.
One letter stood out. It came from a man in his 60s who claimed to have worked construction near a site on the outskirts of Springfield in the early 1990s. He wrote that, on the morning of June 7, 1992, he'd noticed a man parking a car off an access road that led into a wooded area. I didn't think much of it then, he wrote, but I remember the guy seemed out of place. No tools, no reason to be there. Police followed up. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, searched the area, turned up bones, but they were animal, not human. Another lead, like so many before it, that ended in silence. Still, the letter reminded investigators that even decades later, people were still remembering, still watching, still wondering. The enduring mystery of the Springfield Three isn't only about what happened that night. It's about the nature of unresolved grief, about the stories we tell ourselves when there is no final chapter, and about the psychological terrain of waiting for answers, for evidence, for the return of something lost. In the absence of proof, people make meaning where they can. Some believe the women are buried beneath concrete, perhaps beneath a parking garage, perhaps under a rural road. Others are convinced it was a targeted abduction by someone they knew. A few hold fast to the stranger theory, a passing predator, a chance encounter that spiraled into horror. All these versions exist at once, layered over the same timeline, the same house, the same night. No theory is provable, but none can be fully ruled out. In a more recent interview, Janice reflected on the nature of memory. "It's strange," she said. "You'd think I'd only remember the last day I saw Stacy, but I don't. I remember the ordinary ones. Her coming home from school, her brushing her hair. I remember her laugh when I'd mispronounced the names of her favorite bands." She paused then, and smiled. "It's not the tragedy I think about. Not first. It's the living, who she was. That's what's real to me." As for the investigation, it remains technically open. The Springfield police still maintain a tip line. The case file is thick, over 10,000 pages. Evidence logs, interview transcripts, maps, timelines. Each year a cold case detective reviews it, looks for anything missed. In 2025, new forensic tools, once science fiction, allowed analysis of degraded DNA material. Some items collected from the house were retested. One sample produced partial male DNA, but it was inconclusive. No match in Codice. Another haunting almost lead. Still, for those involved, even a whisper of progress mattered. The case has had ripple effects far beyond Springfield. It led to changes in how missing persons reports are handled in Missouri. It prompted renewed discussions around evidence preservation, scene contamination, and early response protocol. And it reinforced what so many families of the missing already know, that in the first 24 hours, everything matters. But despite the lessons learned, the Springfield Three remain unaccounted for. No graves, no crime scene, just the sudden vacuum of 3 lives. In 2023, a candlelight vigil was held at Phelps Grove Park. Dozens gathered quietly beneath the trees. There were no speeches, just photographs placed on tables. A choir sang Amazing Grace. Some attendees hadn't been born when the women vanished, but they came anyway, because some stories live on through the collective memory of a place, and Springfield remembers. In homes across the city, parents tell their children to lock the doors, to trust their instincts, to be careful, not out of fear, but from reverence. Because 3 women went missing on a summer night, and the world kept turning, and no one could say exactly why. Some say evil came quietly that night, slipped through the door in the form of a familiar face, or waited in the dark until all was still. But perhaps the scariest truth is this: evil didn't leave behind a mess, it left behind nothing. It erased, and in that erasure, it left wounds that never fully closed. Janice McCall still believes someone out there knows the truth. Maybe they were young then, afraid, maybe they've changed, maybe they regret it. But she hopes quietly that guilt might do what justice could not. And to those people, she has a message. Just tell us where they are, she says softly. We don't need names, we don't need trials, just help us bring them home. She's not angry, she's not vengeful, she's tired, but still standing. The Springfield Three are more than a mystery. They are daughters, a mother, a friend, a neighbor. Their story is not just about what was taken, but about what remains, the quiet bravery of the people who refuse to forget them. In the end, that's how they survive. In photographs kept above mantles, in drawers that haven't been emptied, in dog-eared yearbooks and voicemail messages saved too long, in the faces of people who remember, not just how they vanished, but how they lived. And until the day someone speaks the truth, they will remain in the stillness of that summer night, waiting. At first glance, Bardstown was the kind of town people passed through without thinking much of. Tucked into the rolling green hills of central Kentucky, it looked like a postcard: historic brick buildings, steepled churches, bourbon distilleries. It was the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their porches, where people greeted each other by name, where the biggest events were homecoming parades and high school football games. But in November of 1999, a quiet disappearance fractured that calm, and it began not with violence, but with silence. Crystal Bailey was 25 years old when she vanished. She lived with her husband, Mark, and their 2-year-old daughter in a modest 1-story home on the edge of town. She was a nurse's aide at the local assisted living center, working long shifts and often returning home exhausted, but smiling. Crystal was the kind of person people remembered for how deeply she listened. Her voice was soft, her manner understated. She remembered people's birthdays. She brought homemade muffins to work. She volunteered at her church nursery on Sundays. To most who knew her, she seemed content, even if she kept parts of herself quiet. Her marriage from the outside looked stable. She and Mark had been high school sweethearts, married at 19. They were both born and raised in Bardstown, both from large families. Mark worked as a technician at an auto repair garage his uncle owned. They had friends. They had routines. But beneath that surface was something lonelier. Friends would later say that in the months leading up to her disappearance, Crystal had grown more reserved. She stopped staying late at work to chat. She skipped church a few Sundays in a row. Her sister Emily noticed that her phone calls had become shorter, less open. And when asked directly if anything was wrong, Crystal always smiled and shook her head. Just tired, she'd say. The night she disappeared was a Monday. Crystal's shift at the nursing home had ended around 7 p.m. A co-worker recalled her saying she was heading straight home to put her daughter to bed. Nothing seemed unusual. She didn't seem upset. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. At 7:45, a neighbor saw her car pull into the driveway. The headlights stayed on for a few minutes. Then darkness. No one saw her after that. The next morning, Crystal didn't show up for work. At first her supervisor assumed she might be sick. But when she didn't call in, and when repeated calls to her home went unanswered, concern began to spread. It was entirely out of character. By mid-afternoon, her sister had driven over to check on her. Mark answered the door. He was calm. Said Crystal had left early that morning, before sunrise, to go visit a friend in Lexington. She didn't want to wake the baby, he said. Said she'd be back late. That explanation didn't sit right. Crystal never left without telling someone. She didn't have a habit of spontaneous trips, especially not on a workday, and she would never have left her daughter behind without saying goodbye. Still, no immediate alarm was raised. It wasn't until the following day, when Crystal missed a second shift at work, and a voicemail from her mother went unreturned, that police were called. A missing persons report was filed. At first officers treated it like a voluntary disappearance. A grown woman. No signs of a struggle. No broken windows or overturned furniture. No financial distress. And her husband said she'd taken a small overnight bag, but Crystal's family was adamant. She would never have left without her daughter, and she never would have gone 2 days without checking in. Detectives asked to look around the house. Mark agreed. Everything appeared in order. The living room was tidy. Dishes sat drying in the rack. The baby's toys were lined up along the carpet. The master bedroom was neat, though investigators noted the absence of Crystal's purse and keys. One detail stood out. A single photo had been removed from the mantel. There were 4 picture frames on display, 2 of Crystal with her daughter, one of all 3 of them as a family, and one frame left oddly empty. When asked about it, Mark said the glass had cracked, and he had removed the photo to get it replaced. Investigators made a note. Small things but unusual. When they asked to search Crystal's car, parked in the driveway, Mark hesitated. She took her keys with her. He repeated, "I haven't touched it." Eventually, after a day's delay, the vehicle was searched. Nothing in the car indicated she had packed for a trip. No suitcase, no overnight bag, no signs of travel at all. And then something else surfaced. When detectives reviewed phone records, they found no outgoing calls to anyone in Lexington. No texts, no indication she'd arranged a visit. In fact, her phone had stopped transmitting entirely around 8:15 p.m. the night she returned home. The timeline grew clearer. Crystal had come home just before 8 o'clock. By 8:15, her phone went dark. By the next morning, she was gone. Detectives interviewed neighbors. One said they heard a muffled argument that evening. Another mentioned seeing the garage light on unusually late. But no one reported screams. No loud crashes. Just a sense that something was slightly off. Mark's behavior drew more scrutiny. He didn't appear emotional. He didn't join search efforts organized by Crystal's family. He refused to take a polygraph, on the advice of a lawyer. And his story didn't change. But it didn't deepen, either. She said she was going to Lexington. He repeated. That's all I know. But police kept asking why would a young mother vanish without a trace, on a Monday night, without her child, without telling her closest relatives. Where would she have gone? And why hadn't she used her phone again? The case stalled. No credit card activity. No surveillance footage. No body. A week later a break came, but not the kind anyone expected. A woman named Kelly Adams, who worked with Crystal at the nursing home, came forward with something she'd been afraid to share. Crystal had confided in her weeks before she vanished. She had been planning to leave Mark. She told me she wasn't happy, Kelly said. She said she felt small in her own home, that she wanted something different for her daughter. She said she was scared he wouldn't let her go. This shifted the tone of the investigation. It no longer looked like a disappearance. It looked like a betrayal. But without physical evidence, there were limits to what police could do. The house was searched again, this time with forensic teams. Carpet fibers were tested. The garage floor examined. A cadaver dog was brought in, but found nothing conclusive. Soil samples from the backyard were taken and cleared. The only DNA collected was consistent with the people who lived there. Mark was never arrested. He remained a person of interest,
but no charges were filed. Crystal's case faded from the headlines. Her daughter was raised by her maternal grandparents. Mark eventually moved to another town. He declined all interview requests. In the eyes of the law, Crystal remained a missing person, but to those who knew her, the truth was simpler. She didn't just leave. Her sister Emily said years later, she was taken. Maybe not at gunpoint, maybe not with a scream, but taken all the same. The weeks after Crystal Bailey's disappearance passed in slow motion. Each day felt longer than the last, especially for her sister Emily, who had made it her mission to never let the search go cold. She called the detective on the case every morning, even when she knew there'd be no update. She drove through the outskirts of Bardstown in a loop, pausing at empty fields, wooded trails, old barns and drainage culverts. She knocked on doors of people she barely knew, asking if they'd seen Crystal or her car that night. She pasted missing posters on gas station windows and utility poles and tucked them behind the wiper blades of parked cars at grocery stores. What struck her again and again was the silence. Bardstown was a place where news traveled fast, where people knew your grandparents, your cousins, your favorite pie at the diner. And yet somehow, Crystal had vanished without a single verified sighting after she pulled into her driveway that night. By early December, nearly 4 weeks into the disappearance, the tone in town had shifted. People weren't speculating anymore. They were settling into belief. She's not coming back, is she? A cashier whispered to Emily one morning, her voice hesitant, almost ashamed. Emily didn't answer. Investigators, for their part, had quietly come to the same conclusion, but without a body or a confession, there was no crime to charge. Only suspicion, and it clung like a fog. Mark Bailey remained in Bardstown through that first winter, but his life shrank. Friends stopped inviting him to gatherings. Former co-workers at the garage whispered when he walked past. His uncle eventually asked him to take a leave from the shop. Just until things cooled down, he said, though Mark heard the real message underneath. He began keeping to himself, stopped answering the door, changed his phone number. On Christmas Eve, a reporter left a note on his porch. It was never answered. Emily visited his house once weeks after Crystal vanished. She brought a small box of her sister's belongings, some makeup, a few sweaters, and a photo Crystal had kept in her locker at work of the two of them at a 4th of July picnic. She left the box on the porch and rang the bell. Mark opened the door, but didn't step outside. "You didn't even come look," Emily said, holding his gaze. "I told the police everything I know," he replied. His voice was low, expression unreadable. "She was scared of you," she said. "She told people." He didn't answer that, just closed the door quietly. Inside the house, the child cried. That sound, so normal, so human, was the only thing that echoed. By New Year's Day, the lead detective on Crystal's case, Sergeant Melanie Cook, made a difficult decision. She held a press briefing to announce that the investigation would be scaled back. "This is not a cold case," she emphasized, "but we are transitioning to a maintenance phase until new evidence arises." Reporters asked about Mark Bailey. She declined to name him as a suspect, but confirmed he remained the last person known to have seen Crystal alive. "Our hope," she said, "is that someone out there knows something they haven't yet shared." That same day, Emily wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper. It ran the next morning on the front page. The letter was short, just 137 words. But its message was piercing. "My sister did not run away. She did not abandon her child. She did not vanish because she wanted a new life. She was taken. If you know something, anything, even if you think it's too small, please come forward. She deserves to be found. And her daughter deserves to know what happened to her mother." The response was immediate. Over the next week, the police tip line received more than a dozen calls. Most were vague. One caller claimed they had seen Mark and Crystal arguing in the Walmart parking lot weeks earlier. Another said Mark had been at a gas station late that Monday night, alone, looking agitated. None of it was verified. One call, anonymous, untraceable, said only, "Check the woods near mile marker 18. You'll find her." Search crews were dispatched. Volunteers combed the area. Cadaver dogs were brought in again. Nothing was found. But the effort reminded people that Crystal's case wasn't just a news story. It was a life, a wound, a missing person with a family who still waited. In February, 2 months after the disappearance, Emily discovered a small spiral notebook in one of Crystal's old purses. It had been tucked into a zipped compartment, missed during earlier searches. The first few pages were blank, but halfway through, Crystal had written brief, fragmented entries, just single sentences or partial thoughts. "I want to leave, but I'm scared of what he'll do. He says no one will believe me. Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing already." The handwriting was unmistakable. Emily brought the notebook to the police. Forensic analysts confirmed the ink and writing were consistent with late 1999. Though the entries were not dated, they offered a psychological portrait of a woman trapped in fear, and potentially a motive. Still, it wasn't enough. Not legally. In April, Mark filed for divorce. He cited irreconcilable differences. Emily and Crystal's mother tried to contest it, but were told there was no legal basis to intervene. The court granted the petition. He was now a single father. Legally speaking, Crystal had simply left, but there was a quiet resistance building. Emily created a website dedicated to Crystal's case. It included photos, timelines, audio from media interviews, and a growing archive of tips submitted through an anonymous form. She called the site Still Missing, Crystal Bailey. Within months, it had been viewed over 100,000 times. One user submitted a tip that stood out. They claimed to have worked with Mark briefly in the summer of 2000, after he'd relocated to Elizabethtown. They said Mark had made a strange comment one day during lunch, after hearing a story on the radio about a different missing woman. "Sometimes people just want to disappear," he said. "And sometimes people help them." The tipster said it sounded like a joke, but the silence afterward felt wrong. Investigators followed up. The tipster didn't remember the exact date or context, and no recording existed. Another dead end, but not forgotten. Meanwhile, Crystal's daughter Olivia was growing up. She was 3 when the case stalled, 5 when her father moved again. By age 8, she had stopped asking questions, at least out loud. But her grandmother kept her connected. She showed her photos, told her stories. "Your mum liked to hum when she cooked," she'd say. "She never liked cold weather. She cried during sad commercials." When Olivia was 10, she asked quietly, "Do you think she's still out there?" Her grandmother didn't lie. "I think someone out there knows what happened," she said. "And I think one day, we'll find out." In 2008, nearly a decade after Crystal disappeared, the case was re-examined by a new cold case unit formed by the Kentucky State Police. Advances in forensic testing had made it possible to reanalyze trace evidence from the Bailey home. Technicians used luminol in the garage and portions of the kitchen. Faint blood traces were detected near the baseboards, but DNA results were inconclusive. The amount was too small, and too degraded to determine source or timing. Still, it raised new questions. Why would there be blood there? And had the area ever been cleaned? When investigators re-interviewed Mark, he declined to comment. His lawyer issued a brief statement. "Mr. Bailey has cooperated fully in the past and has nothing further to add." But behind the scenes, quiet tension was building. In Bardstown, whispers had turned into conclusions. Even people who once hesitated to speak had made up their minds. A former co-worker of Crystal's, a man named Darren Lowe, gave an interview to a regional true crime podcast. "I think she told someone," he said. "I think she finally said it out loud. I want to leave him. And I think he made sure she couldn't." But again, no arrest. As the 2010s wore on, the case became part of Bardstown's troubled law. Other disappearances and unsolved crimes would eventually emerge from the same region, drawing national attention. But Crystal's story remained foundational, quiet, haunting, unresolved. In 2019, on the 20th anniversary of her disappearance, Emily organized a candlelight vigil at the town square. Dozens of people came. Some brought candles. Others brought letters. Olivia, now a young woman, stood at the front. She didn't speak, just held a framed photo of her mother and looked into the crowd with quiet strength. There are stories that stay loud. Stories that demand attention with twists and scandal and spectacle. And then there are stories like Crystal Bailey's. Soft, unfinished, carried forward not by headlines, but by the quiet persistence of love. Time, they say, dulls the edges of grief. But the kind of grief that came with Crystal Bailey's disappearance had no clean edge. It didn't come with rituals. No casket, no final goodbye, no marker to visit. It hovered in the air, a constant possibility of return clashing with the quiet knowledge that she was likely gone forever. By 2021, nearly 22 years had passed since that November night. Emily was in her mid-40s, her hair streaked with grey, her life divided into a clear before and after. She had never left Bardstown, though the thought had crossed her mind more than once. Her job at the library gave her stability, and her advocacy work for missing persons had become a part of her identity. The town saw her not just as Crystal's sister, but as a quiet force of resolve. Olivia, now in her mid-20s, had moved to Lexington to attend college, then stayed after graduation to work in communications. She carried her mother's photo in her wallet. Occasionally, when someone asked about her family, she would mention the case. Not in detail, just enough to explain the lingering pause in her voice when she said the word Mom. The questions, though less frequent now, never stopped entirely. Had anyone ever been arrested? Had they ever found anything? Did she think her father did it? That last question always caught her off guard. She had learned through years of experience how to deflect it without answering. There are people still working on the case, she'd say. Or we just want the truth. The truth. What a strange, slippery thing. By now Olivia had come to understand how many versions of it could exist, even within the same family. She knew what her grandmother believed, what Emily believed, what the investigators thought. But her own feelings were more complex. Mark Bailey had raised her, fed her, bathed her, read her stories, sat through school plays, made pancakes on Sundays. He had never hurt her, never yelled, never raised a hand, and yet she also knew what people said. She had seen the articles, the interviews, the Reddit thread speculating about his every movement the night Crystal disappeared. Sometimes Olivia would lie awake at night and play out the scene in her head, not the one she remembered, because she was too young to recall anything from that time, but the one she had built from pieces. The garage door opening, her mother's footsteps on the gravel, the creak of the back porch steps. Then, silence. In her imagination, she never saw what happened next. The scene always ended in blackness. In early 2022, a new documentary series on unsolved Appalachian cases featured a segment on Crystal. The producers contacted Emily, who agreed to be interviewed. Olivia, after some thought, declined. "I don't want my face to become part of the mystery," she told her aunt. The episode aired in March and reignited interest in the case. Several former Bardstown residents came forward with small recollections, things they hadn't thought about in decades. One woman said she'd seen Mark cleaning out his truck with a pressure washer 2 days after Crystal disappeared, which struck her as odd at the time but not suspicious enough to report. Another man, a retired utility worker, said he remembered seeing a black trash bag dumped in a ravine off the service road near Route 113, not far from the Bailey home. "Could have been anything," he said, "but I remember thinking the location was strange." Investigators followed up. The ravine was searched, but after more than 2 decades, any potential evidence had long since vanished. Still, the renewed attention brought one major development. A forensic genealogist, who had watched the documentary, reached out to Emily with an offer. "If you have anything with Crystal's DNA," she said, We can upload it to a public database. It's a long shot, but if someone ever finds unidentified remains that match, we'd get a hit. Emily retrieved an old baby tooth of Crystal's that their mother had saved. The enamel was worn, but technicians were able to extract a viable sample. In May 2022, Crystal Bailey's DNA profile was uploaded into Amazon GED Match. It felt like casting a line into an endless ocean, but at least it was something. Summer came and went. No matches were found. Then in October, a message came through the still missing Crystal Bailey website. It was unsigned, sent through the anonymous tip form. The message read, "Check the woods behind the old Peerless grain silo. He used to go there when he wanted to be alone. There's something buried." Emily forwarded the message to investigators. She'd received dozens like it over the years, vague, often mean-spirited or downright absurd. But this one struck her differently. The Peerless grain silo had been closed for nearly 30 years, but locals still used the access road that ran behind it. It was less than 4 miles from the Bailey home. The cold case unit responded within 48 hours. With permission from the property owner, they conducted a ground-penetrating radar sweep of the area mentioned. The technology detected a soil anomaly, roughly 4 feet long, 2 feet deep. A team was dispatched to dig. They didn't find a body, but they did uncover remnants of a blue plastic tarp, heavily deteriorated, and fragments of what appeared to be women's clothing, jeans, a section of pink fabric with floral embroidery, and a single sneaker. The items were sent to the state lab for testing. 2 weeks later, the results came in. The jeans tested positive for female DNA. The degraded quality made full identification difficult, but mitochondrial DNA matched the profile derived from Crystal's tooth. Emily got the call at work. She didn't cry at first, just sat in her chair stunned. Finally, after all these years, something real. Not just rumor, not speculation, something physical. The Kentucky State Police held a press conference the next day. They didn't say the clothing proved Crystal was dead, but they acknowledged the location and condition was suspicious. This is now being treated as a homicide investigation, the spokesperson said. Mark Bailey declined to comment publicly. Reporters showed up at his house in central Kentucky, where he had moved a few years prior. He didn't answer the door. His lawyer released a brief statement reiterating that Mark had cooperated fully and continued to deny any involvement. But public opinion had already solidified. Online forums filled with speculation. One local blogger referred to the discovery as the turning point. Even people who had remained neutral began to change their tone. Behind the scenes, the cold case team reassembled the timeline. The tarp and clothing found near the silo had no traces of blood or signs of violence, but the location matched descriptions from 2 separate tips. And the type of sneaker matched a pair Crystal was known to wear, confirmed by a family photo taken just weeks before she vanished. They now had partial physical evidence placing her, or at least her belongings, in a place she had no reason to be. That opened the door to new possibilities. But still, no body, no weapon, no confession. Emily pushed harder than ever. She appeared on local radio, wrote op-eds, posted regular updates to the site. "We are so close," she wrote one night. "Don't let this slip away again." In March 2023, on the 23rd anniversary of Crystal's disappearance, Olivia finally agreed to speak. She sat down with a local journalist in Lexington and recorded a 30-minute interview. It was soft-spoken, measured, almost painfully honest. "I don't know what happened to my mom," she said, "but I know what it's like to grow up with a story that's half missing, and I think someone out there knows more than they've said." The interview aired that evening. It struck a chord. For the first time, Crystal's case wasn't just about a woman who vanished. It was about a daughter left behind, and the deep emotional inheritance of unresolved grief. That summer, the forensic genealogist working on the case made another breakthrough. Using a technique called familial triangulation, she identified a distant male relative of an unknown DNA contributor found on the tarp. The sample didn't match Mark Bailey, but it did match someone close to him. The match was traced to Mark's cousin, a man named Josh Atwell. Josh had worked on Mark's property briefly in the fall of 1999, doing odd jobs after being released from a drug rehab program. He'd never been formally questioned. His criminal record included petty theft and one charge of assault, but nothing violent since. When approached by investigators, Josh admitted to helping Mark clean up something weird in the garage that November had disclaimed. He told me not to say anything, he said it was just trash. He denied knowing anything about Crystal, but his DNA was on the tarp. That was enough to bring him in for formal questioning. What he said next would reshape everything the investigators thought they knew. Josh Atwell looked older than his 46 years. His hair was thinning and grey, and a deep crease had settled between his brows. When the investigators sat him down in the interview room, he seemed tired more than anything else. He didn't ask for a lawyer right away. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat with his hands folded in front of him, and blinked slowly. When asked why his DNA had been found on a tarp buried behind a long abandoned silo, "I figured it had come back to me someday," he murmured. The detective across from him, Detective Hart, who had only been a teenager when Crystal Bailey disappeared, pressed gently. "No accusations, just a space for truth, or something close to it." Josh rubbed his thumb over a scab on his knuckle. "I didn't kill her," he said softly. "I need to say that first. I didn't touch her. I didn't see her that night. But I did help clean up." The silence that followed was heavy. "I didn't know at the time what it was," he added. "Not for sure. But I knew it wasn't right." He described, in halting detail, a phone call from Mark on the night of Crystal's disappearance. It was nearly midnight. Mark said he needed help getting rid of something, wouldn't say what, only that it was important, and he'd pay him for it. When Josh arrived at the Bailey home, Crystal's car was still parked in the driveway. The house was dark, except for a light in the garage. Mark was already there, pacing, pale. He had this blue tarp on the floor, folded tight. I couldn't see what was inside it. He said it was trash from the basement, but his hands were shaking. Josh helped him load the tarp into the bed of Mark's truck. It was heavier than I expected. Too heavy to be just junk. Mark drove. Josh followed in his own car. They didn't speak during the ride. Mark pulled off near the Peerless Grain silo, and led them down a gravel path into the woods. They dragged the tarp into the underbrush and buried it under loose soil and leaves. No tools, just hands and boots. I didn't ask what it was, Josh said, his voice hollow. I didn't want to know, but after that night, he never looked me in the eye again. Mark gave him $400 in cash, and said never to speak of it again. The confession wasn't enough for an arrest. Josh had no first-hand knowledge of what was in the tarp. No direct evidence linked Mark Bailey to Crystal's death. The law required more than implication. Still, for Emily, Olivia, and those who had spent decades yearning for a sliver of truth, it was the first time the silence had been pierced by something close to accountability. Emily wept when she read the transcript of the interview, not just because of what it implied, but because someone had finally said it out loud. Josh Atwell's statement reignited calls for prosecution. A local petition demanded a grand jury review. Prosecutors, after reviewing the materials, acknowledged that Josh's testimony might support circumstantial charges, evidence tampering, obstruction, but not murder. "We understand the public's frustration," the district attorney said in a measured tone, "but the burden of proof is high, and this case, despite its emotional weight, is still lacking critical elements." No charges were filed, at least not against Mark. Josh Atwell, however, was charged with obstruction of justice and abuse of a corpse, charges stemming from the disposal of Crystal's clothing. now believed to have been removed from her body post-mortem. He pled guilty and received a 5-year sentence with parole eligibility after 2 years. He didn't fight it.
I was a coward, he said at sentencing, and I regret it every day. Olivia sat in the courtroom during the proceedings. She didn't look at Josh. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on a photograph of her mother, printed and framed on the bench beside her. When asked if she wanted to deliver a victim impact statement, she stood slowly and approached the lectern. Her voice didn't tremble. I was 2 years old when my mother disappeared, she began. I never got to know her laugh, or what perfume she wore, or how she liked her coffee. I didn't get bedtime stories from her. I don't know what she would have thought of my first job, or if she would have liked my first boyfriend. I missed out on all of that, because someone took her away, and because you, Mr. Atwell, helped hide the truth. She paused. I want to believe you didn't know what you were helping cover up that night. But you knew enough to be afraid, and you let my family suffer anyway. A long breath. I don't forgive you, but I want to thank you for finally speaking. Emily placed a hand on Olivia's shoulder as she returned to her seat. In the weeks following the sentencing, life in Bardstown moved on, as it always had. But something in the air felt different, less heavy, more open. The Bailey house, long since sold to another family, still stood on its quiet corner lot. The rose bushes in the front yard bloomed each spring, unaware of the story they framed. Mark Bailey remained a free man. He issued no statement, declined interviews, and eventually moved again, this time to Tennessee, according to a neighbor. He lived alone. Olivia debated whether to confront him, not with accusations, but with the questions that had haunted her for years. She wrote several letters, never mailed them. In one she wrote, "Do you think of her when you shave in the morning? Do you remember the sound of her voice, or did you bury that too?" She never sent it. Instead, she focused on the living. In 2024, Olivia joined Emily at a memorial event for missing persons in Louisville. They stood together under a white tent, surrounded by others whose grief was suspended in limbo. On a table sat a framed photograph of Crystal, her hair windblown and eyes bright. When it was their turn to speak, Emily stepped up. "My sister was never just a name on a poster," she said. "She was a mother, a daughter, a friend. She made the best sweet tea and sang off-key when she cooked. She wasn't perfect, but she deserved to grow old, to see her daughter graduate, to live a full life." She paused, her voice softening. "We don't know everything that happened, but we know enough, and we want her remembered for how she lived, not how she was taken." There was applause, soft, respectful. Later, Olivia stood beside the display and watched people pass by, stopping to read the name Crystal Bailey and trace the edges of her smile. She wasn't just a mystery anymore. She was real again. The community, too, began to heal. A mural was painted on the side of the old post office, a series of faces, some smiling, some solemn, each representing a missing or murdered woman from the region. Crystal's was among them, her eyes gazing outward, gentle and unblinking. Local schools added a unit on unsolved cases to their civics curriculum, with Crystal's story used as a case study, not of crime, but of advocacy and remembrance. Emily continued to run the support website, now expanded into a broader network for families in similar situations. She worked with volunteers to distribute missing but not forgotten kits to rural police departments, containing updated procedures for handling disappearances in the first 48 hours. And Olivia, in quiet moments, began to write. She started with journal entries, fragments of memory, imagined conversations, dreams, but soon those turned into essays, and the essays became a manuscript. In 2025, she published a memoir titled The Distance Between Then and Now, a soft, reflective account of life after a disappearance. It was not a story of justice, not exactly, but it was a story of love, survival, and the strength required to live with unanswered questions. In the final chapter, she wrote, "The night my mother disappeared is a wound that never fully closes, but it has become part of who I am. I carry her with me, in the way I tilt my head when I'm thinking, in the soft drawl that lingers in my voice, in the way I look at my own reflection,
and wonder which parts are hers. Crystal Bailey's story was never solved in the traditional sense. There was no trial, no confession from the man most believed to be responsible. But in another sense, her story found resolution, not in punishment, but in remembrance. In the love of a sister who refused to stop searching. In the voice of a daughter who rose above silence. In a community that chose to hold space for the missing even when the trail went cold. She is still out there, in the pages of Olivia's book, in the flowers left beneath the mural, in the soft murmur of her name at family gatherings. Not a ghost, not just a case, but a person, and now finally remembered.
It was a Tuesday in late October when 17-year-old Dana Lawson vanished. The year was 1992, and in the small farming town of Maple Hollow, Missouri, where everyone knew everyone, and little changed from one season to the next, her disappearance was not just shocking, it was unthinkable. The leaves had turned and begun to fall in brittle clusters along the gutters of Main Street. Halloween decorations were up on porches, modest and handcrafted, carved pumpkins, paper ghosts, a scarecrow or two. At Maple Hollow High School, students buzzed with the usual teenage chatter. Midterms, football, rumors. The air carried that particular chill that hinted at winter just around the corner. Dana had been seen that morning in the school parking lot, wearing a red flannel shirt, jeans, and a pair of black Converse high tops. She had parked her family's rusted blue station wagon in the third row and walked toward the entrance with a small messenger bag slung over one shoulder. A few classmates remembered seeing her in second period algebra. Others thought they might have passed her in the cafeteria. But by 3 p.m., when school let out, Dana was gone. At first, no one noticed. She didn't have sports or extracurriculars. She wasn't the type to draw attention. Dana kept to herself, quiet, polite, the kind of girl teachers described as reliable. She worked weekends at a local diner and spent afternoons babysitting her younger brother while their mother worked the late shift at the nursing home. It wasn't until 6:15 that evening, when her mother returned home, that the absence began to feel sharp. The house was quiet. The kitchen light was on. Dana's little brother, Luke, sat on the couch watching cartoons alone. "Where's your sister?" their mother asked. "She never came home," he said, without looking away from the screen. That was when the panic started. Dana wasn't the kind of girl to stay out late without telling someone. She didn't have a boyfriend. She didn't go to parties. Her world was school, work and family, and if she was going to be late, especially with Luke home alone, she would have called. Except she hadn't. No calls, no notes. Her station wagon was still parked in the school lot when police drove by that evening. Her bag was missing, but nothing else. The sheriff's department treated it like a runaway at first. That's what they did back then. She was 17. Maybe she'd taken off for a few days to blow off steam. Maybe there had been an argument, a secret. They searched the area, asked around town. A few kids admitted she had seemed distracted that week, tired, maybe a little withdrawn. One girl claimed Dana had told her she wanted to leave Maple Hollow for good, but it was thin. No one had seen her leave. No one had seen anything unusual. Within 2 days, flyers were posted on telephone poles and church doors. Dana's face, with her soft features and dark curly hair, stared back in black and white grain. Her mother did an interview on the local news, her voice shaking, begging for information. She wouldn't just disappear, she said. Something happened, but nothing came. Not a trace, no sightings, no calls, no notes, just silence. For a while people talked. Whispers in the diner, murmurs outside the post office. Some wondered if Dana had been hiding something, a secret relationship, a pregnancy. Others blamed the recent parole of a man who had served time for assault and was now back living quietly in town. There were rumors of strangers passing through, truckers, drifters, tourists on the old back roads who didn't belong, but eventually the talk faded. The flyers curled in the cold wind. The news moved on, and Maple Hollow returned to its routines, albeit with a hollow space at the edge of them. For the Lawson family, however, the days became marked by waiting. Dana's mother fell into a kind of silent routine, working, searching and crying behind closed doors. Luke, only 10 at the time, remembers coming home each day to a locked door, dinner on the stove, and the sound of the police scanner running in the background. They never moved, never left the house. Her mother refused. "What if she comes back?" she would say. But Dana didn't come back. In 1998, 6 years after her disappearance, Dana was officially declared dead. No remains had been found. No evidence, just time and a deepening ache. And then in 2006, everything changed. A housing development had begun clearing land just beyond the woods east of town. Land that had once belonged to an old farm long since abandoned and sold off. Surveyors stumbled upon a concrete septic tank buried beneath what had once been a chicken coop. It was rusted shut and filled with dirt. But something about it seemed off. They called the police. Inside, buried beneath layers of soil and debris, they found a human jawbone, then a rib, then a fragment of skull. Dental records confirmed it within days. Dana Lawson had never left Maple Hollow. She had been there all along. The news traveled fast, faster than it had back in 1992, when Dana Lawson first disappeared. It spread through town like a sudden storm, carried on cell phones, group texts, social media pages, and whispered phone calls between aging neighbors who still remembered the girl with the quiet eyes and soft voice. After 14 years of unanswered questions, Dana's body had been found. It didn't feel like relief, exactly. Not at first. For her mother it reopened everything. The long dormant ache, the years of second guessing, the images she had forced herself not to imagine. For Luke, who was now 24, it was a moment as surreal as it was painful. Dana had been frozen in time in his mind, her memory preserved like amber. 17, laughing gently, arms crossed, standing in the doorway with that bemused look she wore when he said something ridiculous. Now suddenly, there was a place where her bones had rested, a real one, cold and final. The forensic pathologist could confirm only partial details. Dana's remains were skeletal, worn down by time, animals, and the damp compacted earth in which she had been hidden. But her dental records matched, and the necklace they recovered near her remains, a simple silver chain with a small bird charm, had been given to her by her grandmother just weeks before she disappeared. Her mother identified it immediately. There were no clothes left, no notebook, no shoes, no bag, only bone, but the discovery changed everything. The septic tank where Dana was found was sealed with rusted bolts, deeply embedded in the ground. Police noted that it would have taken time to open and reseal, more than one person maybe. There was no evidence of recent disturbance. Whoever put her there had meant for her never to be found. The land had once belonged to the Hembry family, a reclusive farming couple, who had lived off Route 6 until they lost the property in 1995 due to unpaid taxes. The house had since been demolished, but the fields and outbuildings remained, overgrown and forgotten. Roy Hembry had died in 2001. His wife Martha moved into assisted living shortly after. She was now in her 80s and suffering from moderate dementia, but detectives still made the drive to speak with her. Her memory flickered like a broken light bulb. "Dana," she repeated softly, over and over. Sweet girl that Dana, quiet, kept to herself. When asked if she remembered seeing Dana near the property, or if she knew why someone would bury her there, Martha paused. "She brought us eggs once," she said. "Or was it flowers?" Roy said not to let her come by again, said it was none of our business. "I always thought that was strange." She stared out the window for a long time after that, lost in something distant. Though inconclusive, Martha's words suggested what many feared. Dana had not run away. She had been taken, and her body hidden just a few miles from her own home. Detectives turned their attention to Roy's known associates during that time. He had been a farmer, but also known to take on part-time labor, mostly young men, drifters, those who came through Maple Hollow looking for work and moved on quietly when the season ended. Among the names listed on old records was one that raised an immediate flag: Travis Duell, a handyman who had lived in a trailer park just outside of town in the early 90s. He had a minor criminal record: vandalism, drunken disorderly conduct,
a shoplifting charge, but nothing violent. Still, there was something about him. According to records, he had worked on the Hembury property in the fall of 1992, right around the time Dana vanished. Detectives found Travis living in a small town in Kentucky, under a different name, T.J. Duell, but the fingerprints matched. He was now in his early 50s, still single, and still working odd jobs. When police brought him in for questioning, he was calm, measured, almost too calm. "I don't know anything about that girl," he said flatly. "Worked a lot of farms back then. Don't remember most of him." But when they showed him a photo of Dana, the one used on the missing posters, his eyes flickered, just for a second, a twitch, a swallow. Not guilt, exactly, but recognition. "You're sure you don't know her?" the detective asked. "No," he said. "I'm sure." Still, the timing was too perfect. The location, the employment, the proximity. Police obtained a warrant to search his current residence, hoping for a break. They didn't expect much, after all 14 years had passed, but luck or something like it intervened. Behind the drywall in his garage, concealed by a thin panel, they found a wooden box. Inside was a collection of items, old cassette tapes, photos of barns, a folded newspaper clipping about Dana's disappearance, and a locket. A silver locket, badly tarnished, but with a familiar bird etched into the side. It was a match to the charm Dana had worn. When confronted with the discovery, Travis remained silent. Then he asked for a lawyer. That silence, though it didn't count as a confession, cracked the case wide open. He was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, concealment of a corpse, and kidnapping. The prosecution built a careful, deliberate case. There were no eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence tying Travis directly to Dana's death, but the circumstantial evidence, the timeline, the location of her body, his employment at the property, the items in his possession, was powerful. They argued that Travis, a loner with a history of instability, had likely approached Dana either at school or while she was walking home. Maybe he offered her a ride. Maybe he tricked her into coming with him under the guise of work or an errand. However it happened, she ended up at the Hembury farm, and she never came back. The defense, unsurprisingly, argued that the evidence was too thin. Travis claimed he had found the locket years ago and kept it out of curiosity. He denied any knowledge of Dana's fate. His lawyers said there were too many gaps, too much conjecture, that without DNA or eyewitnesses, it was impossible to prove what happened. But in the courtroom, where Dana's family sat each day in aching stillness, the tide turned on something simple, the way Travis looked when her name was said aloud. He flinched every time, not visibly to most, but to her mother, who had watched him like a hawk. It was unmistakable. "He knew her," she said afterward. "I don't care what he says. He knew my baby." The trial lasted 5 weeks. Jurors deliberated for 3 days. They found Travis Duell guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read aloud, Dana's mother didn't cry. She simply nodded, once, and closed her eyes. Beside her, Luke placed a hand on her shoulder. "We brought her home," he whispered. It wasn't closure. Not really. Nothing could undo the years of uncertainty. The birthdays missed. The moments stolen. But justice, late and imperfect as it was, had finally come. Dana was laid to rest beneath a maple tree in the town cemetery, not far from the house where she'd grown up. The service was quiet, attended by family, old classmates, and neighbors who hadn't spoken of her in years but remembered her smile nonetheless. Luke gave the eulogy. It wasn't long, just a few stories, about Dana's gentle humor, her love of drawing, the way she used to make up songs to make him laugh when he cried as a kid. "She didn't deserve what happened," he said. "But we remember her not for how she left us, but for how she lived." That winter, snow-blanketed Maple Hollow, the house where the Larsons once lived, had been sold to another family, but the new owners left a wreath at the gate, white flowers and a ribbon that read, "In memory of Dana." In the years that followed, The town changed little. The population aged. New families moved in. Children grew up unaware of the darkness that had once hovered over their streets. But for those who remembered, Dana Larsson's story lingered like the echo of a name whispered in still air. In the quiet places, in attics and scrapbooks, in folded letters and photo albums, she was still 17, still gentle, still missed, still loved. After the verdict was delivered, and Travis Duell was sentenced to life without parole, the town of Maple Hollow began the slow, quiet process of folding the past back into its corners. But the presence of the trial, its weeks of testimony, the photographs, the names said aloud, could not simply be erased with a gavel. Dana's story had taken root again, deeper this time, and in more painful soil. People spoke her name differently now. Not as a question, but as a memory. The wound had closed, in a way, but the scar was fresh. There were calls for change in the wake of the trial, though they came softly. Parents met at the school gymnasium to discuss safety protocols, and the need for better support systems for teenagers who seemed off or withdrawn. But there was no system that would have caught what happened to Dana. She had not screamed, had not left a note, had not given any clear sign she was in danger. In many ways, that was what haunted people most. One of the jurors, a woman named Irene Foster, would later say that the hardest part of the trial wasn't the evidence, it was the stillness in Dana's mother's face. Every time the prosecution showed a picture of her daughter, there was no drama in her grief, no noise, just that quiet, terrible stillness. The look of a woman who had spent years waiting for someone to knock on the door. But despite the closure of the case, questions lingered like morning fog across the farmland. Not legal questions. Travis was convicted, but deeper ones. Why her? Why then? And most of all, was he alone? The theory prosecutors laid out was plausible, but not complete. There were gaps they couldn't fill. For one, Travis was not known to have had a vehicle in 1992. He had a license, but the Hembry farm was several miles from Maple Hollow High School. Dana's station wagon was found at the school. How had he gotten her to the farm? Had he forced her into another vehicle? Had someone else helped? Or had she gone willingly, lured by a favor or a false emergency? There were also no witnesses. No neighbors saw anything. No one at school remembered Dana leaving with anyone that day. One of her classmates, now an adult who had moved to Kansas City, recalled seeing her near the parking lot just before the final bell. She had been standing alone near the bike racks, arms crossed, eyes distant, but no one had seen what happened after that. And there were the items, especially the newspaper clipping. Why would Travis keep it? Why save a report about a missing girl, unless it meant something? Was it guilt? Pride? Or did it serve another purpose? One detective, speaking off the record to a local journalist, speculated that Travis may have revisited the scene more than once, that perhaps he had returned to the burial site over the years, maybe even moved the body at some point, though this was never confirmed. The remains were too degraded to say with certainty how long they had been in the septic tank. In truth, the answers may have died with Roy Hembry, the original owner of the farm, though never charged. The timing of his ownership, his proximity, and his wife's strange recollections all cast a shadow that was hard to ignore. Martha Hembry passed away only months after the trial, her memory having deteriorated into a soft flickering fog. In her final weeks, she sometimes asked the nurses when the girl with the silver bird necklace was coming to visit again. She promised me she'd bring lilies, she whispered once. Dana always brought lilies. There was no record of Dana ever having met the Hembrys directly, but memories are strange things, and truth, in small towns like Maple Hollow, is often passed down in pieces. After the trial, Luke returned to the town cemetery every Sunday, often bringing fresh flowers and sitting in the grass near Dana's grave. He had grown into a thoughtful man, tall, quiet, with the same dark eyes Dana had. He rarely spoke about what had happened. When people asked, he'd nod, say thank you, and move on. But privately, He kept notebooks, journals filled with Dana's name, letters to her, fragments of dreams he'd had over the years. One entry, dated 3 weeks after the verdict, read, "I keep wondering what you were thinking in those last moments. Were you scared? Did you know what was happening? I wish I could have been there. I wish I had waited by the door for you like I was supposed to. I would have run to the school. I would have screamed. I'm sorry I didn't know how to look for you." Dana's mother, Jani, sold the house that same year. It had become too much. The creak of the floorboards, the smell of the laundry room, the window in the kitchen where Dana used to sit and draw in the mornings, everything had become a reminder. She moved to a small apartment in Springfield, closer to her sister, and began attending grief support meetings held in the basement of a church. She spoke rarely, but the others listened when she did. One evening, she stood up and said, "You think time heals, but it doesn't. It just teaches you how to carry it better." That winter, Luke started a scholarship in Dana's name at Maple Hollow High School. It was small, just enough for books or supplies, but it was awarded to students who planned to pursue psychology, counseling, or social work. She would have been good at that, he told the school board. She always listened when no one else did, and she had listened. In old yearbooks, classmates wrote the same thing again and again: "Thanks for always being there when I needed someone to talk to." In spring of that same year, construction resumed on the housing development where Dana's remains had been found. There were protests, small but heartfelt. Some argued it was sacred ground now, that no family should build a home over such a terrible history. But eventually, the houses went up, young families moved in, lawns were planted, and the memory of what had been buried there slipped further into the soil. Still, some things could not be erased. One of the new residents, a young mother named Kayla, claimed her daughter, only 4 years old, spoke of a girl in the trees. A girl with a red shirt and black shoes who never came home. They chalked it up to imagination. Children sense tension, even in silence. They hear things in whispers. But still, the mother sometimes found her daughter staring out the window at night, quiet, as if waiting for something. Luke never heard about this story. He didn't need to. He had his own sense of where Dana lived now, not in the trees, but in the quiet spaces people leave behind when they're taken too soon. In 2010, he published a memoir, The Silence Between Bells, a soft, aching book that chronicled his childhood, the years of uncertainty, and the slow path toward understanding. It was never a bestseller, but it found its audience: families who had lost someone, communities trying to make sense of senseless things. In it he wrote, "Dana wasn't a ghost story. She wasn't a symbol. She was my sister. And every time someone says her name, they bring her back to life, even just for a moment. That's what remembering really is." By the time the 10th anniversary of the trial approached, Maple Hollow had changed. The high school had been renovated. The diner where Dana used to work had closed, then reopened under a different name. Most of her classmates had long since moved away, scattered across the Midwest with jobs and families of their own. But some came back, quietly, for the small memorial that Luke organized. They didn't bring signs or candles, just flowers, stories, photos from an old scrapbook that had somehow survived 14 years of weather and time. One of the pictures showed Dana in her red flannel shirt, arms crossed, smiling gently at the camera, as if to say, "I'm still here." And in a way, she was. Years passed. The case of Dana Lawson became one of those stories that local teenagers heard in hushed tones, part true, part legend, told with nervous glances at the woods lining the town's edge. Her photo, once stapled to telephone poles and taped to diner windows, was now tucked into a shadow box that hung quietly on the wall of the Maple Hollow Public Library, next to a plaque that read, "In memory of Dana Lawson, 1975, 1992. She listened, even when no one else did." Some people walked past it without noticing, others paused. A few left flowers on the windowsill nearby. Nobody vandalized it. Even kids who didn't believe in ghosts kept a respectful distance. There was something about Dana's story that stuck, because it wasn't about monsters in the woods, or a stranger pulling up in a dark van. It wasn't the plot of a horror film or an urban myth. She had disappeared in broad daylight, in the middle of town, among people who believed they knew everyone. In 2018, a journalist named Amber Keller, who had been born and raised in the county, began working on a long-form investigative series for the local public radio station. She had grown up hearing whispers about Dana's disappearance, and remembered the feeling of seeing the missing posters as a child. Now an adult, and a mother herself, she wanted to go deeper, not just into the crime, but into the community around it. Her first episode aired in October of that year, and was simply titled, "The Day She Vanished." Listeners responded immediately. The voice Amber used in the narration was slow, reverent, almost meditative. She didn't sensationalize. She lingered in the quiet, on memories, on pauses, on what was left unsaid. By the third episode, the series had drawn thousands of listeners from across the state, and eventually the country. In one installment, Amber interviewed Luke. His voice was low and even, filled with thoughtfulness. He spoke not just about his sister, but about the ache of living in a town that had both remembered and forgotten her. "Some days I still expect to hear the door open," he said, "as if all these years were a mistake, and she's just coming home late from school." Amber asked if he believed Travis Doole had acted alone. Luke paused for a long moment before answering. "I think he was responsible," he said, "but alone? I'm not sure. I think someone saw something, maybe even helped, or at the very least knew." This quiet suspicion wasn't new. Even after the trial, there had always been a lingering sense that the story was unfinished. Though Travis had been convicted, many locals believed he hadn't worked alone. Some pointed to his brother, who had left town years earlier, and was later arrested in Texas on unrelated charges. Others mentioned a friend of the Doole family, who had worked on the Hembry farm during the early 90s, but without evidence, it remained conjecture. Amber dug into these leads. Her research uncovered a detail that had never been made public during the trial, possibly overlooked, possibly suppressed. A woman named Paula Everly had called the sheriff's department the night after Dana's disappearance in 1992. She lived a few miles north of town, and had reported seeing a car she didn't recognize pulled off near the woods just after dusk. She'd noticed two men standing by the passenger door, and what looked like someone, she thought it was a girl, being led into the trees. She hadn't thought much of it until she saw Dana's photo the next day. Her call had been logged, but apparently never followed up. Amber interviewed Paula, who was now in her 70s, and living in assisted care. Her memory was worn but clear on some points. "I told them," she said. "I said it looked wrong. She didn't walk on her own. They didn't care. Said it was probably teenagers fooling around. There had been no car description taken, no follow-up. It was a failure that could no longer be undone, but it raised more questions. Was it Travis? Was he one of the men Paula had seen?" Amber submitted a Freedom of Information request, and eventually obtained the original call log. The timestamp lined up exactly with the window when Dana had gone missing. She aired the discovery in the final episode of her series. The community's response was swift and emotional. The sheriff at the time was long retired, but some pushed for a reopening of the investigation. New searches were discussed, of the wooded areas, of other properties formerly owned by the Doole family. But without new forensic evidence, there was little that could be done. The case, as far as the courts were concerned, was closed. Still, the attention brought Dana's story to a new generation. Students at Maple Hollow High School started a small memorial garden on campus. They planted lilies, her favorite flower, according to Luke, and placed a stone marker there that read, "For Dana, and for those still waiting to be found." Each spring, they held a candlelight walk through town, ending at the edge of the woods where the housing development now stood. No signs, no chants, just silence and light. For many it was a way to say, "We remember, you're not forgotten." As for Luke, he eventually moved out of Missouri. He settled in Colorado, working as a counselor for children in crisis. In interviews, he often said that Dana was the reason he had chosen the path he did. "She was taken," he once told a colleague, "but I don't want her to be the only story I carry." He married in 2021. At the reception, instead of a bouquet toss, he and his wife donated to a missing persons foundation in Dana's name. And yet, some nights, he would wake to the sound of wind moving through trees, and feel a weight in his chest. Not fear, not sadness, exactly, but a kind of echo, as if some part of her still moved quietly through the world, just out of reach. In 2024, a documentary was released, based partly on Amber Keller's podcast and Luke's memoir. It was quiet, beautifully shot, and focused less on the crime itself than on the ripple effects on how a single disappearance could change the texture of a place forever. One scene showed Dana's mother, Janine, now older, walking through a community garden near her apartment. She stopped by a flower bed and pointed to the lilies. She used to draw them, she said softly. Big ones, with long leaves, always in the margins of her notebooks. The camera lingered on her face as she smiled faintly, then looked away. "I still wait for her, sometimes," she added. "I know it sounds strange, but I do." The final image of the film was Dana's photograph, not the grainy black and white one used on missing posters, but a color image from her 11th grade yearbook. Her head tilted slightly, a soft smile on her face. It faded slowly into a field of flowers as the screen went dark. Dana's story was never just about tragedy. It was about memory, silence, and the spaces between. About the questions that never quite stop asking themselves. About the way a single sudden loss can echo across decades, and how, even in stillness, there are voices worth hearing. She was 17 when she disappeared. She is still 17 in every photograph. And every time someone speaks her name they remind the world, she mattered. She still does.
The last time anyone saw Dr. Meredith Black alive, it was a cool evening in mid-March, 2007. She was stepping onto her front porch in Athens, Georgia, holding a glass of red wine and wearing her favorite blue cardigan. The porch light had just flicked on with the fading sun. It was a Sunday. Neighbors remembered her waving politely, as she always did. One couple walking their dog said she smiled at them and commented on how early the dogwood trees were blooming that year. Another neighbor, a young college student who lived across the street, saw her sitting in a wicker chair, legs crossed, a hardcover book balanced on one knee. The next morning, she was gone. Her house was quiet. The newspaper sat untouched in the driveway. Her car, a silver Honda Civic, was still parked in the carport. The front door was locked. At first, no one thought much of it. Meredith was a professor at the university, known for being independent, focused, and occasionally hard to reach during writing sabbaticals. She lived alone, rarely had guests, and didn't keep a close circle of friends. But by Tuesday, when she failed to show up for her advanced ethics seminar, one of her students, who had grown fond of her dry humor and meticulous style, reported her missing. Police conducted a welfare check that afternoon. They found the house in perfect order. No signs of forced entry, no spilled wine, no broken glass, no blood. The porch chair was pushed slightly back, as though someone had risen from it in a hurry, or perhaps not in a hurry at all. Inside, the air was still. The TV was off. Her laptop sat open on the dining table with a half-written email on the screen, time-stamped 8:43 p.m. Sunday. The message was addressed to a former colleague at Emory University. It read simply, "I've been meaning to reach out. I think I've finally made peace with it. I'll call you soon." It was never sent. A search began that night. Canvassing the neighborhood turned up little. No one had heard a struggle. No car was heard pulling away. The only unusual sound came from a neighbor who reported hearing what she thought was a gate creaking just after 9 p.m., something she assumed was the wind. Meredith's backyard backed up to a small wooded area, and a walking trail popular among local joggers. Police searched the trail by flashlight, combing through underbrush, but found nothing out of place. By Thursday, the university had posted a notice about her absence. Rumors began to circulate. Some believed she had taken a sudden leave of absence, others whispered of mental health struggles, but no one knew for sure. It wasn't until the following Sunday, 1 week after she was last seen, that a group of hikers found her. She was lying face down in a shallow stream bed 3 miles from her house. There were no signs of trauma, no wounds, no bruising, no indication she had fallen or been dragged. Her body was fully clothed and barefoot. The soles of her feet were dirty but uninjured, suggesting she had walked there herself. Toxicology would later show a low amount of alcohol in her system, consistent with the glass of wine, but nothing else. No sedatives, no drugs, no note. The autopsy was inconclusive. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. There were no signs of drowning, no water in the lungs, no signs of hypothermia. It was as though her body had simply shut down. The coroner noted one unusual detail: her expression. Her face, even in death, was described as calm, peaceful, eyes closed, a faint crease between her brows as though in thought. The case was never declared a homicide, nor was it ruled accidental. Instead, it sat in a strange, quiet space, suspended between mystery and the unnerving possibility that some questions have no answers. But as detectives began looking deeper into Meredith's life, a portrait began to form, one that made the quiet suburb of Athens feel far less peaceful than it had appeared. Meredith Black had secrets, and some of them had been very carefully kept. 2 weeks after Dr. Meredith Black's body was discovered in the streambed, a light rain fell over Athens, softening the edges of the town's sidewalks and muting the usual bustle of early spring. On campus, her absence hung over the philosophy department like an unfinished sentence. Her name was still on the course roster. Her books remained on her office shelves, orderly alphabetized, and marked with countless sticky notes in precise cursive handwriting. At her desk sat a small photograph in a silver frame, Meredith younger, beside a man with broad shoulders and a crooked smile. Both wore black graduation robes. The photo was never referenced in her faculty bio. Few colleagues knew who the man was. When a department assistant gently lifted the frame to dust around it, she noticed the inscription on the back: Meredith and Jonah, Columbia, 1998. I still believe in you. Jonah Reynolds. The name hadn't come up during the initial investigation, but when detectives reviewed her old personnel files, especially those from her time at Emory University, it appeared multiple times. Meredith and Jonah had co-authored 3 academic papers on moral philosophy and behavioral ethics between 1999 and 2003. Their work was dense, highly respected, and focused on ethical contradiction, why good people make questionable choices, and how the mind rationalizes betrayal. By 2005, the co-authorship stopped. Meredith had left Emory the following spring, moving to Athens to teach at the university and withdraw from academic conferences. She never publicly explained the move. Some said it was a decision for a slower pace. Others believed something had gone wrong. Detectives contacted Jonah, who was now teaching in Boston. He answered their call within an hour and agreed to meet with them remotely. His voice, captured in the transcript, was quiet and slow, filled with long silences. I hadn't heard from her in years, he said. Then the day before she died, I got an email. Just one line. The detectives asked him to read it aloud. I've forgiven you. I hope you've forgiven yourself. The timestamp matched the one on the draft email found open on Meredith's laptop. But there was a difference. Meredith had never hit send. Somehow Jonah had received it anyway. The question lingered: had she typed 2 versions? One she sent to Jonah, and another she started for someone else. Or had the message to Jonah been drafted on another device, perhaps her phone, which had never been found? Detectives asked Jonah about their history. He hesitated before answering. We were very close, he said, for a time, but it became complicated. We disagreed on something fundamental. When pressed further, he declined to elaborate. She was brilliant, he added.
And she carried things very quietly. People thought she was reserved, but it was more than that. She didn't trust easily. The conversation ended without further insight. But Jonah's words shifted the tone of the investigation. What had Meredith been carrying all those years? And why, just before her death, had she reached out to a man who had once been part of her inner world? Detectives began interviewing former colleagues and students from Emory. Most described her as intense, precise, and deeply private. She was known for pushing her students hard, but also for defending them fiercely. She disliked administrative politics. She almost never attended social events. One professor recalled that in the spring of 2004, Meredith took an abrupt leave of absence, citing a personal emergency. When she returned, she was visibly thinner and more guarded. She wasn't herself, he said. Or maybe, she was more herself than she'd ever been, and it scared her. He remembered her sitting alone in the faculty lounge one afternoon, staring out the window. She said something I'll never forget. She said, "If you dismantle everything you believe in, what's left?" Then she just stood up and walked out. Others confirmed she had grown increasingly distant before her departure. One student assistant remembered finding Meredith in her office one evening, sitting in the dark. She looked like she'd been crying, the assistant said. But not recently. The kind of crying that comes after you've accepted something terrible. The assistant had asked if she was okay. Meredith had smiled softly and said, "I'm learning how to be." No one could say what had prompted her withdrawal from Emory. There were no official complaints, no disciplinary actions, no published scandals, but something had happened, and whatever it was, Meredith had never spoken of it again. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued combing through her digital records. One discovery stood out. 6 months before her death, Meredith had begun researching whistleblower protection laws. Her browser history included pages about faculty misconduct, Title IX protections, and legal definitions of coercion in academic environments. She had also downloaded a 56-page guide, titled Documenting Ethical Violations in Academia, a step-by-step approach. None of these files were saved to her laptop. They were found only in temporary memory. When detectives revisited her email archives, they found a folder labeled Drafts Archive. Inside were several unsent messages, all dated from the fall of 2006. One stood out. It was addressed to an unknown recipient and read, "I kept the letters even after I said I hadn't. They're in the lockbox. I didn't come forward then because I was afraid. I'm still afraid, but I don't want to carry this anymore." There was no name, no context, but the mention of a lockbox prompted detectives to revisit her home. Hidden behind a row of books in her bedroom closet, they found a small fireproof safe. It had no key, only a combination dial. After 3 failed attempts, a locksmith was brought in. Inside the box were several items. An old Polaroid photograph of Meredith standing with 3 men at what appeared to be a conference. A receipt from a hotel in Atlanta dated March 2004. A handwritten letter signed only J, and a stack of printed emails from a university address later traced back to a now retired professor at Emory. The emails were unsettling. They began with academic collaboration, discussions of upcoming lectures, research grants, and curriculum development. But over time the tone shifted. Compliments became personal, then possessive, then threatening. "You said you trusted me," read one. "You don't get to walk away now." The final message, sent in early 2005, read, "This doesn't disappear just because you transfer to another school. You forget who got you here." The emails had never been reported. The man who sent them, Dr. Howard Delling, had retired in 2011 after a 30-year tenure. He lived in South Carolina and, when contacted, he refused to speak with investigators. Legally, there was little to pursue. The statute of limitations had passed, and there was no indication Delling had any involvement in Meredith's death. But the picture was becoming clearer. Something had happened in Atlanta, and Meredith had carried it with her to Athens, into her teaching, into her silence. She had built a life of calm, thoughtful structure, but underneath, Something unresolved had followed her every step. Back in Athens, the neighborhood where she had lived remained unnervingly quiet. Her house had been sealed, pending final disposition by her estate. Flowers and notes had been left on her porch, but by April most had withered or been blown away. One note remained, tucked into the frame of her screen door. It was written in pencil on lined paper. No signature. "You were right to keep going. I wish I'd told you that when I had the chance." Detectives bagged it for evidence, and submitted it for fingerprinting. Nothing turned up. The handwriting was never matched. But to those who had known Meredith, even distantly, the message felt like something she had needed to hear. The town moved on, as towns do. The university held a memorial lecture in her name that fall, titled, "The Ethics of Silence, How We Speak for the Missing." Students read selections from her published work. Colleagues spoke of her brilliance and kindness. One former advisee read a journal entry Meredith had once shared during office hours. It read, "Peace is not the absence of pain, it's the ability to keep walking with it." The crowd sat in stillness after that. Some wept quietly. Others simply closed their eyes. Meredith Black had left no will, no immediate family, no clear answers. But her life, its stillness, its quiet struggle, its final message continued to echo in the places she had touched. The house on Sycamore Lane remained empty, but the air around it held something delicate, something not quite finished. By late spring, the town of Athens had resumed its seasonal rhythm, students trickling home after final exams, dogwoods fully bloomed and beginning to fade, and the long Georgia evenings drawing neighbors back onto porches and quiet trails. But beneath the surface of campus and community, the questions surrounding Meredith Black's death remained unresolved. Detective Laura Ellison, assigned as lead investigator on the case, had never been fond of ambiguity. A former social worker turned homicide detective, she was known for methodical thoroughness and emotional restraint. But this case had begun to weigh on her more than most. It was, she admitted to a colleague, not just that Meredith had died, but the way the world around her had failed to notice the quiet signs of unraveling. For Laura, the case had begun to take shape like a slow-moving storm, one that hadn't yet broken, but cast long shadows nonetheless. She kept coming back to the note found on Meredith's porch. "You were right to keep going. I wish I'd told you that when I had the chance." The tone was intimate. It wasn't a stranger's condolence. It was regretful, personal. The paper had been folded carefully, with one crease down the middle, written in pencil, not torn from a notebook, but rather the kind of paper kept in old-fashioned pads, like something from a school teacher's drawer, or the back of a church pew. No fingerprint match had been made. The note held no clues beyond its contents, and yet Laura was convinced it mattered. She revisited the names of every person who had attended Meredith's memorial, digging quietly through university records and old student rosters. She looked especially at students who had taken multiple courses with Meredith, who had visited her office often, or who had been advised by her. One name emerged again and again, Caroline Mays, a graduate student in the Department of Philosophy. Meredith had supervised her master's thesis on moral injury in public service, an emotionally demanding topic focused on the psychological impact of violating one's own ethical code. The paper had been deeply personal. Meredith had described it, in one email to a colleague, as the most courageous student work I've seen in years. Caroline had been in her final year when Meredith died. She was now working in nearby Atlanta, teaching at a small liberal arts college. Laura called her. The conversation was brief at first. Caroline was hesitant, polite, but guarded. "Meredith meant a great deal to me," she said. "She helped me see through something I couldn't even name at the time." When asked if she had remained in contact with Meredith after graduation, Caroline hesitated. "She sent me a message last winter," she said. "A short one, just said, 'Keep going.' That's all. But it came at the right time." Laura asked if they'd had any personal conflict. If Caroline believed Meredith had been in distress. There was a long pause. "Not overtly. she finally said. But I think she was carrying something heavier than she ever let on. I think she was exhausted. Laura pressed gently. Did she ever mention anyone she feared? No, Caroline said. She didn't speak in terms of fear. She spoke in terms of damage. That some things change you in ways you don't always notice until you try to go back. When asked directly whether she had left the note on Meredith's porch, Caroline denied it. I thought about visiting. I did drive by her house, the week after, but I couldn't get out of the car. Laura believed her. Caroline's tone had the raw precision of someone still trying to untangle what Meredith had meant to her. Still, the conversation added a subtle dimension to the story. Meredith, it seemed, had not completely isolated herself. She had planted small seeds of hope in others, even as she pulled deeper into herself. And there was one more clue Caroline offered without knowing it. She told me, once, Caroline said, that she kept a box of letters from her grandmother, that they reminded her who she used to be. Letters. Detectives had already found one set in the safe behind the closet bookshelf, but those were academic, tactical, used to document past misconduct. Had there been others? Laura obtained a new warrant to search the attic and basement of Meredith's home. The crawl space beneath the stairs held little more than old lecture notes, holiday decorations, and yellowed newspapers. But tucked behind a file cabinet in the attic's far corner was a small wooden chest. It was locked, but not strongly. A flathead screwdriver opened it. Inside were envelopes, worn, soft-edged, clearly handled often. Dozens of them, all in the same elegant handwriting. The return address was from Savannah, Georgia, the grandmother. Some letters were dated as early as 1987, others were as recent as 2001, all were written on pastel stationery, with cursive loops and graceful phrasing. The content was gentle, encouraging, warm yet perceptive. Remember, darling, you are more than what the world sees in you. Courage isn't about confrontation, it's about not folding in on yourself. When people disappoint you, it doesn't mean you were wrong to hope. There was one letter that stood out from the rest. It was undated, folded twice. If you ever need to leave, do it before you start believing that staying is the noble thing. You are not here to be someone else's keeper. Laura sat with that sentence for a long time. She began to wonder if Meredith's move to Athens had been not just about distance, but about survival, a quiet escape, a recalibration, and yet something or someone had pulled her back toward the shadows of her former life just before she died. There was one last thread left to tug. The hotel receipt found in the safe. It was from March 2004, a single night. Atlanta, room 214. The hotel had changed hands since then, but archived records showed that Dr. Meredith Black had checked in using her own name. The room had been paid in cash. She had checked out before dawn the next morning. Laura cross-referenced the date with university records. That same night, a faculty dinner had been scheduled at Emory, honoring retiring staff. Dr. Howard Delling had been among the guests of honor. Laura's breath caught. Had Meredith checked into the hotel to avoid the event, or to avoid someone who would be there? Further inquiry showed that she had submitted her notice of leave just 2 days later. The emotional timeline was tightening. The silence was beginning to speak. But as Laura prepared a summary for her department, one more message arrived. An anonymous tip, handwritten, scanned and emailed through a secure submission portal. She was trying to warn someone. I don't know who, but she didn't give up, even when she knew it wouldn't save her. Don't call this a disappearance. She was taken long before her body left. It was unsigned. The investigation had no path forward. No suspect, no crime officially identified. And yet the haunting weight of intention lay over every page of the file. Meredith Black had not been a passive figure. She had not quietly faded. She had maneuvered, endured, remembered, and in small private ways resisted. Even in her final message she had chosen forgiveness. Not submission, not surrender. The detectives closed the file under the official label, unresolved. But for Laura Ellison, it remained open in her mind. one of the rare cases that didn't ask to be solved, so much as understood. In the final months of the year, Meredith's house was cleaned out by university staff and sold quietly to a retired couple who'd never heard of her. The walls were repainted, the carpet replaced, but the porch chair remained, the same wicker seat where she was last seen, glass of wine in hand, book balanced on her knee. A quiet memorial plaque was placed under the flowering dogwood tree in her backyard. It read only, Dr. Meredith Black, teacher, writer, witness, no cause of death, no epitaph, just a single word that hinted at all she had carried. Witness. The winter after Meredith Black's death settled over Athens with a quiet intensity. The trees had lost their leaves, and the sharp chill in the air was softened only by the occasional grey drizzle. At the university, the semester was well underway, but the memory of Meredith lingered like a gentle, persistent shadow. Detective Laura Ellison had returned to the case file several times over the months since her last meeting with those who had known Meredith. The more she studied the letters, the emails, and the fragments of a life carefully documented and deliberately hidden, the more she realized that Meredith's story was not simply one of tragedy, but of a profound and ongoing struggle with silence, fear, and ultimately the courage to confront the very darkness that had shaped her. The investigation itself had become less about identifying a culprit, and more about understanding the complex web of human relationships and decisions that had led to that cold January night. When Meredith's body was found near the creek, there was no doubt Meredith had been deeply wounded, psychologically and emotionally, long before her death. But the exact circumstances, the final moments, and the forces at play remained veiled. Laura found herself drawn again to the photograph found in Meredith's office, the one of Meredith and Jonah Reynolds at their graduation. The man's smile was warm, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Their joint work on moral philosophy and behavioral ethics, particularly on the subject of betrayal, had once been lauded in academic circles. But the rift that had emerged between them was a mystery. Reaching out to Jonah a second time, Laura hoped to gently explore what Meredith's message, "I've forgiven you, I hope you've forgiven yourself," could mean. When they spoke, Jonah's voice was quiet but steady. "I never imagined she would reach out again," he said. "It was unexpected. We had a falling out over a matter that cut deep. She believed I had compromised my principles. I believed she was too harsh in her judgment." Laura asked if he thought Meredith had been in danger. He was silent for a long moment. "Danger," he repeated. "Not in the physical sense, but danger to one's integrity, one's sense of self. Yes, she was fighting to hold on to something pure, something she felt was slipping away." The conversation left Laura with the sense that Meredith's greatest battles were internal, yet no less real for being invisible. In the weeks that followed, Laura met again with Caroline Mays, the graduate student who had been one of Meredith's closest mentees. Caroline shared more about Meredith's final months, the cautious ways she had begun to open up, the small acts of reaching out to friends and colleagues, who had previously been kept at arm's length. She wanted to believe things could be different, Caroline said. But the past, it hung over her like a weight she couldn't shake. She spoke of Meredith's belief in forgiveness, not as a release for others, but as a way to free oneself. She said, "Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." Caroline's eyes welled with tears. She was so tired. But she kept going. "I think that's what she wanted people to know, even when it feels impossible." Meanwhile, forensic and digital experts worked to reconstruct Meredith's last days. Though her phone was never found, analysis of her laptop and email accounts revealed a final thread of communication with a third party, a university counselor named Dr. Ellen Matthews. Dr. Matthews confirmed she had met with Meredith several times during the fall and winter of 2006. The sessions were described as focused on anxiety, depression and coping strategies. Meredith had been forthcoming but guarded, often steering conversations away from personal details. She was immensely private, Dr. Matthews said. But I could tell she was carrying a heavy burden. She never spoke explicitly about any threats, but she did express feelings of isolation and mistrust. Their last session had taken place 3 days before Meredith's disappearance. She mentioned a letter, Dr. Matthews recalled, something she'd written but hadn't sent. She said it was a way to put her thoughts in order. When Laura asked if Meredith had named anyone in particular, Dr. Matthews shook her head. No. But she was worried about the consequences of speaking out. The counselor expressed her hope that Meredith had found some peace. That hope, however, was complicated by an unexpected discovery. In late February, a local hiker reported finding a small leather-bound journal partially buried near the creek, where Meredith's body had been found. The journal's pages were filled with entries dating back several years. They reflected a mind wrestling with complex ethical questions, personal regrets, and memories that refused to fade. One entry, dated December 3rd, 2006, stood out. Some wounds are invisible. They cut through the fabric of trust and leave nothing but threads to hold us together. I want to believe that telling the truth will heal these wounds. But what if the truth itself is what breaks us apart? Other passages revealed Meredith's struggle to reconcile her professional ideals with the realities she faced. I taught about moral courage and the importance of standing firm, yet I feel my own resolve faltering. Is silence complicity? Is speaking out reckless? What is the right path when all paths lead to pain? The journal was a mirror to the letters she'd kept, an internal dialogue between hope and despair. Throughout all this, the community around Meredith quietly processed her absence. Her students remembered her not just as a scholar but as someone who truly listened. One former student who preferred to remain anonymous wrote a message to the university's philosophy newsletter. Dr. Black taught me that philosophy is not just about ideas but about empathy. She showed us how to question ourselves gently, to hold our doubts without fear. At the local bookstore where Meredith had often browsed, a shelf had been dedicated to her favorite works, texts on ethics, existentialism and human resilience. The small memorial plaque beneath the dogwood tree became a place for quiet reflection. Passers-by left notes, flowers, and sometimes small stones, tokens of remembrance. A professor who had once debated with Meredith at length about the nature of forgiveness later reflected, she was the kind of person who never gave easy answers, but she always asked the right questions. As spring approached again, Laura Ellison visited Meredith's former home one last time. The house was no longer empty. The new owners had made it their own, filling the rooms with light and warmth, but the garden remained, wild and untamed, with the dogwood tree standing tall, its blossoms just beginning to open. Laura stood beneath its branches, feeling the weight of the case of Meredith's life and death settle around her. She thought of the woman she'd never truly met, but whose story had become a part of her own. Meredith had lived with courage, not the kind that demands headlines or heroism, but the quiet, steady bravery of confronting oneself every day. She had faced betrayal, fear and loss, yet she had chosen to keep going, to teach, to write, to forgive. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest truth of all, that even in silence, even in shadows, there can be light. If there was a final message Meredith wanted the world to hear, it was not about the mystery of her death, or the pain she carried, but about the resilience that defines us all. A resilience that allows us in moments of darkness to find a reason to keep walking. The case was closed without resolution to every question, but the story remained, an invitation to listen, to remember, and to honor the fragile, complex humanity at its heart. And sometimes, that is enough.